Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
The car braked sharply and Eugene's body. The force of inertia threw him backwards. The businessman's head described an ellipse in the air. And in the final phase, it came down on his head with a swing. A funny thought went through the man's mind. Probably this is the kind of tests they do with astronauts. But the flush of positivity instantly disappeared, and the anger that had accumulated since morning spilled out on the driver in a poisonous cloud. "Moron, what are you doing? You're not hauling firewood." The outburst of frustration made the boys squeeze their heads into their shoulders. Stammering, he began to justify himself. "I'm sorry, Eugene, but if I hadn't slowed down in time, there would have been trouble. You see that white Audi over there? Looks like it's driven by a cretin or a fucking extremist. He was gonna cut us off." Eugene Grimes rubbed his neck, wincing in pain. "And if you're expecting a thank you, you're hoping for nothing. And the next time you do something like that, you're gonna get corked out of your job." "Sec." The driver, barely audible, mumbled. Mike had had a hard time finding this bread and butter place and was afraid of being out of work again. For more than 2 months he had been serving Grimes, but there was no way he could settle into his character. The businessman was too kind, or he would tear up and throw up for no reason. Today he was clearly off on the wrong foot. Mike noticed it at once. Sad thoughts made the guy distracted for a while. So from all sides drivers were pressing the klaxon and trying to shout to him. Since now Grimes' car was the only obstacle to normal traffic. The statuesque passenger had to once again exert verbal influence on the impressionable drivers. Eugene leaned forward slightly and bellowed loudly, "What are you standing there for? Can't you see that a traffic jam has formed because of you? What are you stopping for? You weren't raised in a boarding school for the retarded, by any chance." Mike, I really wanted to sass the chief for humiliating him. But he clenched his teeth tightly and kept silent. The car moved smoothly. From the back seat came a loud sigh of relief. "I finally got it. I'd thought we'd be stuck in the middle of the road." Grimes liked to operate with unfamiliar words, though he completely failed to understand the meaning of many metropolitan expressions. He had inherited such a lexical load from his Aunt Adriana. The woman many years ago voluntarily undertook the obligation to bring up her nephew. But for 10 years, the aunt has given up a lot and now needed care herself. Therefore, Eugene sheltered a relative in his mansion, so that the elderly woman felt in complete comfort. He hired a housekeeper. At first, Adriana was strongly opposed to this decision, and at one time even resented her nephew. "I have not yet reached the stage of people who are able to cope with the house. Why spend money on servants? He joked gently, for you, grandfather. I do not spare any money. You're my queen in life, and I feel it is my duty to provide you with royal living conditions." Adriana sighed for a while and then accepted the presence of a strange woman in the house. Later, they even became friends with Anna and played cards in the evenings to pass the time. But this morning, the aunt shocked her nephew with unpleasant news. "Eugene, you were late last night, and I didn't want to spoil your mood." He tried to make a joke out of habit. "Adriana, I was spoiled without you last night. So I didn't sleep much last night. Just a little bit in the morning, you know. And now my head is buzzing like a cauldron. So one more hit in my honey barrel won't change a thing. Tell me what happened." Auntie's eyes widened in an expressive way. "Anna's leaving. Said she couldn't be torn in two anymore." The news really struck the man. He looked suspiciously at the elderly relative. "You didn't have a fight with her, did you?" All the same, more girls rounded their eyes. "I'm not a provocateur, and me and my leg have nothing to share. I don't know why she's suddenly decided to break up. She's got a good salary, and she's got a good job. She gave you a reason." The aunt sighed heavily and looked away. That gesture was a sign that the woman was trying to hide something. The aunt's tone changed when she told you the reason. "Anna said she was very tired, and there were some problems at home with her son. But I think it's because of Vanessa, and she's very sensitive. She once confessed to me that she couldn't bear to look at sick children." Adriana was ready to burst into tears, so Eugene had to change to a sterner tone. Don't be upset. Auntie will manage. Anna can go wherever she wants. I won't hold anyone back. I hope she will give us time to find her replacement." The old woman shrieked noisily. I asked her, and she said she could only work until the end of the week. Grimes remembered that today was Thursday, which meant there was only one day left. It would be impossible to find a decent housekeeper in such a short time. He understood all the difficulties of the situation, as well as the fact that he could not leave his aunt with her sick daughter. The old woman simply could not cope with such a load, as it was pointless to solve such a serious problem on the fly. He tried to reassure his relative. "I will look for a new employee today. Don't get upset. You shouldn't be. You told me yourself that everything is for the best, and we will definitely succeed. And the day will come when our Vanessa will recover." Eugene tried to reassure his aunt, and the only joy in a man's life was his daughter. It was for her sake. He tried by all means to increase the family capital. He dreamed that his only heiress never needed anything, but trouble warned him where he didn't expect it. About a year ago, Vanessa began to complain of severe weakness. The girl literally fell off her feet from fatigue. And this in second grade. She and her aunt thought it was just a normal childish whim. They became seriously worried when the girl lost her senses right during the lesson. Vanessa studied in an elite gymnasium, and Grimes was fully confident in the professionalism of the staff of this institution. So after the incident, he sounded the alarm. "We should get her to a doctor. Maybe she's not bleeding enough. It happens a lot in children." Since Grimes was a prominent businessman, no one could refuse him. The very next day, his daughter was examined by the best specialists in town. The conclusion stunned the loving father. "We're sorry, but your girl has malignant leukemia." It sounded like a sentence for a 9-year-old girl. The man lost his ability to speak and made strange noises for several minutes. The doctor was frightened by this reaction and hurried to calm the unfortunate man. "Eugene, you can't overreact. The achievements of modern medicine can achieve amazing results in the treatment of cancer. Children are especially promising in this regard, and very often doctors are able to achieve a full recovery. So there is reason to hope for a good outcome." It was only after these encouraging words that Grimes came to his senses. Interesting people, you medical professionals. Although, fortunately, I rarely have to deal with you. But every time I'm amazed at your ability to first destroy all hope in a person, and then say that everything is almost all right. The professor who evaluated the results, Vanessa, didn't understand the irony. We're not omnipotent, but there's always a chance. Your case is no exception. And with the right therapy, there is a chance to suppress the process of the professor. At least 5 minutes proved to him how important it is to set the patient on a favorable course. At the same time, he flaunted incomprehensible medical terms, which made Eugene completely despondent. The only understandable fact was that his daughter was seriously ill and needed long-term treatment. That same day, Vanessa was admitted to a specialized clinic. And in the life of Eugene Grimes began the most difficult period. Due to a serious illness, the girl had to drop out of school and switch to homeschooling. During the next few months, the girl several times went to the hospital for another course of treatment, and then returned home completely powerless. Therefore, the father tried to create special conditions for his daughter. Just a few days ago, the boy was released home after another course of therapy. The news of Anna's sudden departure took Grimes by surprise, because he had some serious business problems. The man thought about all of this on his way to the main office. He even involuntarily burst out. "What a bad day today. Mike has already managed to forget about his offense from the former cheerfulness." Asked Eugene, "Did you say something?" Grimes smirked. "Yes, I did. I had a bad day this morning. I'm sitting here wondering what bad luck is. How do you deal with bad luck?" Mike showed real skill in the vise in the chief's car, in the narrow space in the parking lot outside the office. After the successful operation, he asked to want some advice. Grimes, with the same smirk, replied, "Go ahead. Roll with it. Try not to think about this very bad luck. The more a person thinks about problems, the more weighty they become. It's a proven fact. I've experienced it myself, so to speak." Eugene, for the first time in 2 months, looked with respect at the boy, whom he hired reluctantly at the request of an acquaintance. The latter had asked very much for Mike, assuring him of the boy's decency. Today, the young driver had impressed the chief for the first time. Perhaps it was the only positive fact in a series of troubles. Grimes strode briskly toward the building, clearing his mind of extraneous thoughts as he went. He took the elevator to the 6th floor and flew through the reception area to the office on his way, tossing to the secretary, "Invite Jones, this is urgent." No sooner had Eugene made himself comfortable in his supervisor's chair. As the head of the supply department, trembling and lost from intense excitement, timidly crossed the threshold of the office, Eugene was summoned. Grimes cast a fleeting glance in the direction of his subordinate and a glance across the table at you, Jones. "I do not propose, for I have no desire to converse with you in a respectful tone." Jones barely audibly jumped. "Eugene, what have I done wrong this time?" Grimes elevated himself above the table. "It's the same thing. The fool is the one who tries to cheat me, and you, Jones, are the chief of those fools. You must have forgotten that my basic education is economics. I also have a law degree." The boss threw a lightning-like glare at his subordinate, and Jones shrank like an air mattress with all the air drained out of it. "Eugene, I still don't understand what you suspect me of." Grimes has lost patience, and they are suspicious, and I'm warning you for the last time. Stop stealing my money. You must have forgotten that I personally check all financial documents, and I have a special instinct for fraud. Try to explain to me, Gleb, why, for example, all tenders are won by one company, Magnum. How is it different from other suppliers? After that question, Jones went numb, and Grimes pushed him. "Shut up, then I'll answer it for you. It's all about Magnum, a company with a very dubious reputation." Your relative's working on Jones' forehead. A dense vapor has set in. Panicked thoughts whirled around in his head. The man instantly turned very pale with exertion. Grimes noticed what was happening to the subordinate and slightly slowed down, and the idea of a tablet. "The secretary will give it to you. I don't want you to give up here in front of my eyes." Jones nodded vigorously and backed toward the exit. Grimes wiped his fingers with wet wipes as if he had just touched a disgusting substance. "Jones, I hope you realize that this is my last warning. Work honestly and you'll sleep well." Jones slipped out the door, and Grimes immediately summoned a secretary. "Tell Favors that I am waiting for her." The girl promptly obeyed the chief's command. But Maria Favors, unlike the previous visitor, behaved very confidently in the chief's office. Grimes was satisfied with the report of the chief of the press service. "I wish everyone worked like you, Maria. Everything is clear and to the point." The chief's praise of Catholics bound the tender female soul. But all emotions Favors restrained within herself. She confined herself to the laconic. "Thank you, Eugene, for your appreciation of the work of our department." Grimes thought for a few seconds, and then asked Maria, "I have a personal favor to ask of you." The woman did not even tense up, and with the same readiness she answered, "I will try to do everything I can for you. You know that my daughter is seriously ill." Favors, with a nod of the head, confirmed this fact. The woman who was taking care of her and helping us around the house suddenly decided to quit. "I understand you, Eugene. I will try to find a replacement for your employee. Tell me, do you have any special requests?" Grimes answered right away. "The most important thing for me is that she be a good person. She's only 9 years old. She's just a little girl. She's been through such a misfortune. Of course, it would be nice if the woman had a pedagogical education. We're way behind the school program." Favors has assured the chief that she'll be looking for one right away and demanding a candidate. Grimes breathed a sigh of relief, for he knew that Maria was a woman of her word. Betty threw an absent look at the boxes of her belongings and the disassembled pieces of furniture. That seemed to be it. All that was left was to wait for the car and see to the loading of things. She tried not to think about how she would live her life. In principle, it didn't matter anymore, because Betty didn't care now, so as not to lose her mind at all. The woman encouraged herself half-heartedly. "Betty, not to despair at all. Things may yet get better for you. A lot of people are like that, when everything falls apart at once, and then suddenly there is a ray of hope. The woman looked at the calendar that hung on the wall as a reminder of her past happy life. Did I forget to take it off for you? I'm sorry, I'll make it up to you. She carefully removed the brightly colored booklet with positive pictures and noticed that she hadn't marked her days for a long time. The habit of accompanying her actions with words worked again, and the woman turned to the calendar with sadness. Well, friend, tell me, what day is today, March 20 or 21? And then she answered, I think it's Friday, the 20th. Let's see what the day has in store for us. Betty turned the calendar page and quickly found the information she was looking for. Oh, turns out it's a day that's not so ordinary. It's the vernal equinox and winter is coming. It's coming to an end. It's a good time to think about starting a new life. A demanding call at the door interrupted the woman's train of thought. But she did not even flinch from surprise, but rather indifferently said openly, Come in and don't be afraid. The door immediately opened. Betty said disappointedly, It's you again. Do you have to remind me every day? As you can see, the apartment is already empty. Not today. I'm selling it tomorrow. Bailiffs. They're the ones who decided to disturb the widow in the morning hours. They weren't embarrassed at all. They made a masterly inspection of the whole place. The man who was in charge of the duo said to Betty, It is not for us to ask such questions to your spouse. The woman didn't let the official finish his thought and nervously interrupted him. All right, tomorrow just 40 I will go to the cemetery and be sure to ask my late husband. How could he do this to me? Hopefully he'll give me a sign from the grave. The performer realized that he had made an inexcusable mistake in talking to the young widow and tried to apologize. We sincerely sympathize with your grief, but the law is the law. You must realize that it's in your best interest to speed up the repayment process, because interest is accruing every day. Betty ran her hand over her face tiredly. I'm aware of that. As you can see, the process is in full swing. But I don't want to give up my apartment for nothing. It's my only place to live, by the way. You see, I have nowhere to go. I can't go to the train station, can I? You left me nothing. Even the furniture and my personal belongings have been described, and this is despite the fact that I have not yet inherited. The second executor is younger. Rudely interrupted Betty's debtor. That's your problem. We're not a charitable organization. We're in the business of collecting debts. You'll have to pay your late husband's debts anyway, so it's best not to create artificial obstacles. Thank you for not kicking me and beating me out of my money. Betty did something akin to a curtsy. In truth, it made the little official even angrier. Citizen, be careful with your words, or we can charge you with insulting someone during the performance. The young colleague dragged the older coworker to the door. Having warned the landlady the other day, we're still seeing you, whether you like it or not. We are obliged to supervise your compliance with the court order. In the empty apartment, the sound of closing all the doors seemed very loud. Betty's whole body shuddered and immediately began to calm herself. Be patient, friend. You just don't have any other options. Yes, your hubby gave you a piggyback ride, but you can't speak ill of the dead. At least you got a chance for a fresh start, although it's foolish to give yourself the benefit of the doubt. At 36, despair burst out with a scream. Betty joined the wall and began to slowly slide to the floor. Why is everything like this? Why is it me that all of this happened to me? The woman's tearful eyes stared pleadingly into the structure on the forest ceiling, as if that was where the answers to the widow's many troubling questions were hidden. 15 years ago, when Betty Svikova married a young but successful entrepreneur, she could not even in a terrible dream imagine what would be the end of her family happiness. She always liked independent, established men. Arthur Williamson fully met these criteria, so Betty did not hesitate to agree to his proposal to become a wife, even though they had been dating for less than 2 months. But Aunt Camille, the sister of her late father, the girls, upon learning of the impending wedding, was horrified. Betty, what are you thinking? Do you know that your Arthur was a gangster in the 90s? I can't even begin to imagine how many lives he's ruined. Betty calmly replied to her aunt, I know my future husband's biography very well, but that doesn't change anything, because at that time everyone was surviving as best they could. The aunt was indignant. How can you speak so calmly? After all, your father's life was taken by scumbags like your Arthur. Auntie, how do you know that? The inquest found no one responsible for Daddy's death, and you claim to know what really happened? The aunt had nothing to answer because she really had nothing else but assumptions. As a final argument, the woman cited her own intuition as proof. Betty, you're still young and inexperienced, and I've lived half of my life in this world. And my heart tells me that your Arthur is a wolf in sheep's clothing. I mean, he pretends to be a decent man, but he's really a thug. For the sake of your father's memory, come to your senses. Betty didn't suffer from levity like most girls her age. She had been left without parental care at a very early age, and Aunt Camille had replaced her father and mother. She had not told her niece for a long time how her parents had died. She was afraid of traumatizing the girl's psyche, even when Betty was old enough to tell her the secret. Her aunt only told her in generalities. In his youth, your daddy graduated from a mechanical engineering institute and worked at a factory. The perestroika came, and the enterprise was shut down, and people were thrown out on the street. He was a very responsible man. He understood that he was responsible for his wife and daughter. He and your mom, even before the damned wind of change blew, managed to buy a car in turn, and your father began to drive people in the evenings. Although the earnings were not particularly large, but there was enough for bread and milk. Episodes from that period often stirred Betty's memory. She remembers well the cherry-colored car, which was the pride of her father. After all, it was about this car that the daring girls from the popular combination group sang. After each trip, Daddy would tidy up his favorite car. See, daughter, what an extraordinary car your daddy has. They even sing songs. Betty believed in her father's version and diligently helped her father to keep the legendary car in decent condition. But one day her father didn't come home. Her mother thought he'd gotten some out-of-town customers, probably asked for a ride somewhere in the country or even the neighboring region. Don't worry, Betty, your father will be back by lunchtime. But lunch arrived. Then her dinner, accidentally discovered by mushroomers in the forest of the neighboring region. The car wasn't there. What did it say about the mercenary motive for the crime? Buried the man with the whole house, because Ira's mother did not have money even for a coffin. The investigation was soon closed because it was considered that Ilya Svetkov himself left this world. Valentina long went to different offices, trying to find the truth, but the woman everywhere sent to a known address. That evening, my mother took earrings to Aunt Camille and promised to pick you up tomorrow. Did you obey your aunt? Don't spoil yourself. The girl waited for her mother all the next day, but she never showed up. And the next day, Aunt Camille cried a lot in the morning and told someone to think of her daughter. I, too, have gone to the extreme many times, but I've never looked for the truth at the bottom of the glass. And now, as soon as I think of my children, bad thoughts disappear. An unfamiliar voice contradicted Aunt Camille. At least you have a job, and the children are all grown up. Your daughter-in-law has no support left. After her husband died, the aunt interrupted. Don't grown-up children need help, and I can't live on my salary. That's why I trade in all sorts of nonsense to stay afloat. The women began to discuss the advantages of the market economy. Ira became uninterested in listening to them. She went into the kitchen, where work was in full swing. The girl asked Aunt Camille, "We are having a party today, and my mother is coming to it." The aunt darted her eyes away and clutched at her heart. The unfamiliar woman, who was cutting sausage with a huge knife, pressed the earring against her and began to whisper, "Your mommy won't come, little girl. She'll never come. She's dead." Later, Betty learned that her mother had poisoned herself with poor quality drink when she didn't come for her daughter in the morning, and her aunt, smelling something wrong, went to their apartment. The door was wide open. It was not difficult to guess from the commotion in the apartment what a noisy party there had been the day before. Apart from the landlady, 2 other women had almost fallen victim to the fun. 2 other women. But the paramedics managed to pump them out. With great difficulty, Aunt Camille sold the bad apartment and took the orphaned former niece in. Your allowance is small, so the money from the apartment will be very useful to us. I'll put it aside for your studies. Aunt Rhea had not only her own life, but also the life of her little niece. Day after day, she beat into the girl's head that only educated people can find happiness in life. Until she was 15, Betty believed in her aunts and her version of the world order. But then she realized that luck comes to those who have a lot of dough, so that her niece did not turn from the right path of aunts and had to make a lot of effort. When after the first year of Pedagogical Institute, Irinka suddenly said that she had made a mistake with the choice of profession, Aunt Camille stood on the fringes. "It seems to you, girl, only seems. I'll give you a diploma, whatever it costs me." To realize this project, the relative even used forbidden methods. At one time, she openly followed her niece until she was ashamed. "Aunt Camille, I'll go to lectures. I'll get that damn diploma. But I beg you, don't follow me." For a while, the aunt was still following me, but in a covert way. The woman's close tutelage helped Betty to get an education. Aunt Camille cried for a long time when her niece showed her diploma. In a fit of emotion, she turned to late brother. "Now I can die in peace because your daughter and my niece did her duty on her own feet. She's got a good profession." The girl had a different opinion about that. She had not worked in the school in a year when she met Arthur Williamson, who completely changed her ideas about real life. After the wedding, her husband immediately told Betty, "I don't want you to work. My status doesn't allow it." Arthur and made this demand in such a tone that Betty took his words as an order. For the first 6 months of married life, the young woman enjoyed a rich life, but then she became bored. Her husband could stay away from home 24 hours a day. He never initiated her into his affairs and always answered questions evasively. "My little fish, I'm busy worrying about our future. If I relax for a minute, everything can fall apart." When Betty got pregnant a year after the wedding, her husband was not happy as she expected, but expressed his displeasure. "It's a little early for you and me to have kids. I hope you know what to do." The shock was so severe that 2 days later the woman had a miscarriage. She stayed in the hospital for a week, and her husband brought her huge bags of fruit and flowers to her room every day. The neighbors envied Betty for such a man, like behind a stone wall. But she couldn't tell strangers that her happiness was just a mirage. Betty longed to fall in love with her aunt again. But the relative had already sold her apartment and left to live with her eldest son after the first collapse of her hopes. And Betty completely resigned herself to fate. She no longer dreamed of a bright and joyful future. The monotonous days and weeks flew by, but nothing changed. Arthur was completely immersed in his business. She was his free appendix. Shortly before his death, her husband once said at dinner Betty was spotted. "You and I have one very important thing to do." She was used to the fact that her opinion didn't matter in her husband's house. That's why I was surprised by that and the unintentionally dropped phrase. "Arthur, what are you talking about?" On the man's face wandered a mysterious smile. "About nothing like that. I'm not about to turn 50. And I have no hair." Betty stared at her spouse in bewilderment. It seemed to her that she had heard or that Arthur Williamson, who had once deprived her of the opportunity to become a mother, was sitting in front of her. Resentment sickeningly skated to her throat, and she spat in the face of this self-righteous. "And Pavlik all that many years saved up in the soul. You think that everything in this life should happen at your click. It's a little late, you've come to your senses. Honey, your son would be 13 now if you hadn't given up on him." But his wife's longing-filled words, and even her tears, did not impress the man. He answered very calmly. It was not the time to have children then. Betty asked with a sneer now, "Then the hour of X has come." "Did you ask me?" He stared at her for about a minute as if he had just met her. "If you don't want to have a baby, there are others who do. You women are such creatures, you'll do anything for pretty trinkets, won't you? Anyway, think about my offer." Betty, after that conversation, roared all night. She was hurt and humiliated to realize that her husband treats her as a thing that can be thrown away or replaced. But at the same time, she realized that she was nothing without him. Becoming parents, those Williamson never succeeded. Arthur's business had gotten into serious trouble, and for over a month he was not himself. One day he received a call on his cell phone, and after talking to an unknown caller, the man felt sick. Betty called an ambulance and Arthur was taken to the hospital. For 8 days, he was in intensive care, and on the 9th day, he died of a massive heart attack. Then, during the most difficult days, Betty learned that her husband was deep in debt and credit. The bailiffs first came to describe the property when the man was still alive. They were not embarrassed by the fact that the defendant was in intensive care. They performed their duties with ostensible indifference, advising Betty to pay off his debts as soon as possible. Shortly after the bailiffs left, employees of the freight transportation company showed up. Quite quickly, they took out the furniture, which Betty decided to sell cheaply to her neighbor Aunt Rye. The elderly woman was very happy when the widow made her a tempting offer. "Oh, and I've been planning to change the furniture at the dacha for a long time. My husband and I renovated my parents' house, and all the old junk she had to throw out for obvious reasons. We were going to buy new furnishings, but in stores such prices on the joy of the buyer agreed to even pay for the services of movers from his own pocket, which was also a huge plus for the widow, because all the proceeds from the sale of property money should have gone to cover the debts of her late husband. But besides the obligatory items of expenditure, it was necessary to leave money for living. With this question, there was a complete impasse. Betty thoughtfully whispered, "Where will I live tomorrow?" It's scary to even think about. Betty felt uncomfortable in her empty apartment. She wandered aimlessly through the rooms, not knowing what to do next. Around noon, her empty stomach reminded her that she needed food, as all the dishes and furniture had gone to their new mistress. The widow decided to eat somewhere on the side. She had to go on foot to find a catering point, as her husband's new car had been sold a month ago. With the sale of her litter soap, Betty decided to hold off for now, secretly hoping she wouldn't have to. "If there isn't enough money, then I'll sell mine too." The woman grinned crookedly, remembering how her husband had criticized her choice of car. "Betty, is this a car for a real lady?" "It is, in which you can only travel around the city. And I don't plan to travel long distances. And where would I go, Arthur? Only to the store and the market." My husband did not impose his opinion. "See for yourself. If you like this model, I won't discourage you. By the way, could you visit your aunt or meet some of your girlfriends?" Arthur was the epitome of generosity and kindness that day, although he knew perfectly well that his wife's aunt had long gone to the other side of the country. And with all her friends, she had cut off all relations in the early years of her marriage. Only with Svetlana Elchenko. She called occasionally to vent. Betty thought that her memory had planted the idea not in vain, and from the branch she took out her cell phone and quickly found the right number. "Hi, it's been a while since we've talked. How would you like to meet?" Her school friend was glad to receive her call and expressed her willingness to meet even now. Youthful excitement filled the woman's heart, and she hurried to the cafe where we always have lunch. Jenna and Betty make unparalleled coffee there, and the prices don't bite so much. That's the word the meeting place was a stone's throw away. But Betty took it in stride anyway, desperate to share her worries with someone. And deep down, she hoped that Jenna would help her find a job and temporary housing. With Elchenko, they had sat at the same desk at school for several years, and then their paths had diverged. Betty entered the pedagogical school, and Jenna decided to learn the fashionable profession of makeup artists at that time. Despite the risks, the girl immediately decided to work for herself. The first 3 years, she put beauty on the lady with a small capital opened her own salon. According to rumors, in her personal life and classmate too, everything was quite successful. Betty entered the cafe and immediately heard the calling cry, "Betty, I'm here. Fly over." The friend settled down at a table in a cozy corner of the small hall and decided, "I hope you'll forgive me for being unauthorized. But I've ordered a skewer for 2. I don't have much time, but we can chat freely for half an hour." Jenna laid it all out in one breath, while Betty made herself comfortable at the table. Only then did she remember that she hadn't offered condolences to her friend. "Betty, I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. That you're alone now. I can't tell you how sorry I am. If you need any help, don't hesitate. Goodbye." Jenna had time to eat and talk. There was an endless stream of positivity coming from this charming woman. Betty felt somewhat relieved. "I'm afraid I'll be misunderstood." If I start whistling right now. Elchenko froze with her mouth full just saying goodbye to the pie. She said in a businesslike tone, "It seems that you're really screwed. If you are ready for unconventional actions, lay out everything in order. I'll think about it as I go along." Betty didn't have to beg long and briefly told her friend about her predicament. As she spoke, Jenna's face showed anger and confusion. What angered her most was that Betty's late husband had spent considerable sums of money on his mistress. "Of course, I've met a lot of scoundrels in my life, but this is the first time. I'm sorry, but your Arthur doesn't deserve a kind word. How low can you go to leave your wife with such debts?" Betty grinned lightly. "It's not the whole picture. Imagine I still had to pay the bills my husband spent on his mistress." Elchenko screamed so loudly. "Betty, are you a fool for making the staff of the establishment worried?" A waiter ran up to their table. "Ladies, please be quiet. We value our reputation very much." Jenna paid the bill and after a second of confusion added 2 more large bills. "This is for your establishment as compensation. Can we sit here for another 5 minutes? We'll be on our best behavior." Honestly, the waiter gave them a smile. "Take all the time you need. If you feel like ordering coffee, I'll be right here." Jenna clicked her tongue. The kid's got a lot going for him, and he's got a nice face. That's the kind of character that attracts customers. Betty gave her friend a look that made her glaze over. "I'm sorry, Betty, but I always get a professional hunch. It's something like sniff and cheek." Noticing that Betty had picked up her purse, Elchenko patted himself Porto with the palm of his hand. "I'm not telling all my friends. That is, I wanted to say that it's time to get to the point. From everything you told me, I realized that you need a job and a place to live." Betty put her purse back where it belongs. "Yeah, at least we'll have to find something for a while. But I don't know where to start." Jenna raised her eyes upward, and with her foot she began to march and rhythm. It lasted about a minute, and then her friend said confidently, "No problem with housing. I can offer you to live at our dacha for a while. It's not far outside the city, about 15 minutes by car from work. So far I cannot think of anything. You're not going to agree to waving a rag and a broom." Betty exhaled. "I wouldn't want to. But if I can't find anything suitable, I'll have to." She didn't have time to finish her sentence because Svetka slapped the Eureka table. How could I forget? The waitress jumped out from behind the partition separating the hall from the kitchen. Jenna waved at him. "It's okay. We can have another cup of coffee." The guy rushed to fulfill the order, and Elchenko gave his friend a sly wink. "You remember Maria Simmons? She's Maria Favors now." Betty strained her memory and with great difficulty remembered the main activist of their school. Semenova was always ahead of the curve and often blew the whistle for the whole school at significant events. Jenna did not wait for Betty's answer. "Just the other day I was in the region on business, more precisely, at the presentation of new products of a well-known company. Anyway, there I crossed Simmons, that is, with Favors. Imagine, she is the press secretary of Grimes himself, the CEO of this very company. I have the name somewhere in my notebook, but that's not important. What's important is that the man urgently needs a woman with a teaching degree." Betty's burning hopes were instantly extinguished. "Stata, I've been working at the school for less than a year. My diploma is no longer valid, and I'm not going to show it." Elchenko waved his hand carelessly. "Yes, in no hurry to refuse. Anyway, I'll give you Maria's phone number. Call her to find out what's what." Jenna on a napkin wrote down the number. "Don't put it off. Call her right now. According to Maria, this businessman's situation is catastrophic. His little daughter seems to be sick, and he has no one to take care of her." Hastily hummed and pecked her friend on the cheek and immediately disappeared. Betty stared at the napkin with an unfamiliar number written on it in confusion. She flinched when the waiter's voice came from the side. "You were just leaving. What about the coffee?" A miniature tray held the same doll-like cups of the disbelieving beverage. Betty smiled. "Your coffee is really great, and I'd love to have another cup." The waiter carefully placed one appliance on the table and just as quickly removed himself with his tray. Betty pictured the guy happily drinking the free coffee. She looked at her napkin again and pulled out her phone. Maria Favors answered immediately. I am very pleased that you responded with all the details in person. So if possible, please come right over today. Betty mumbled timidly, but I have no acquaintances in the city. If you have no place to stay, this issue is solvable. Don't think about domestic difficulties. Come and dial me immediately. Betty didn't expect the case to take such a quick turn, but she didn't want to miss the opportunity. It was 80 kilometers to the regional center, and the woman decided to get to her car, although there was excitement in her soul. But for the first time in the last 15 years, there was hope that she would be able to change her monotonous life. Vanessa leaned over the table in a creative burst, and Betty watched as the skinny child's hand put strokes and drawing on the paper. The girl's artwork was virtually indistinguishable from the artwork of children of that age. The prize spot and the cottage with a pair of cats was surrounded by a hedge, from behind which could be seen the crowns of trees and a dog box. The manner of execution was unusual. Strict, straight lines and strokes made the drawing aggressive. The complete absence of bright colors added to the unpleasant impression. Betty cautiously asked Vanessa, "Why did you draw everything with a simple pencil? Where are the flowers?" The girl looked up, and Betty felt uneasy at her piercing gaze. But it was the girl's words that caused the consternation. Where the dead live, flowers don't grow. Everything is gray there, trees, grass, and sky. For a moment, it seemed to the woman that something cold touched her neck, and she shuddered. Shouldn't you be painting the realm of the dead? Look how many interesting things there are around. The girl stepped and angrily said, "Why should I look at all this and memorize? If I'm going to die soon anyway. Who told you such nonsense?" Anna, when the doctors told her I had cancer, she was immediately frightened and said she didn't want to work for us anymore because she was afraid of getting infected. Betty physically felt like a terror. More and more possessed her by the minute. But the worst part was the 9-year-old girl's casual talk of her illness and imminent death. The new mentor was scolding her predecessor in her heart. What kind of a heartfelt person do you have to be to say such a thing out loud to a child? She calmly said, "Your Anna has deceived you. Many children with a diagnosis like yours have overcome the disease and made a full recovery, and you will definitely get better." Vanessa looked her straight in the eyes again. "You say that to reassure me. Your father must have told you to. He tells me every morning, too, that I'm going to get better. But I keep getting better and better, and I keep getting worse." Betty sat down next to her ward and softly put her arm around her skinny shoulders. "The thing is, little girl, pills and shots are not enough to get better. You have to believe. And that starts with a smile. You have a beautiful smile, by the way." Vanessa was a little embarrassed by her pale lips, stretched the boaters. Educated by this reaction, Betty continued, "You see, it's nice to smile yourself, and it doesn't hurt so much anymore." True to her word, the girl nodded her head with a short hedgehog of trailing hair in agreement. Betty continued the therapy session. "You're doing a great job of smiling. Now try drawing a different house. Make it bright and the trees green. And let the little dog peek out of the box. Do you like dogs?" A smile came back on the girl's pale face. "I do. We used to have a typhoon, but then he ran off with a puppy. Daddy didn't want it. I begged him to. What kind of dogs do you like? Try drawing one." Vanessa was confused for a second. She first put her sad drawing aside, but then moved it back to her. "Okay, Betty, I'll give it a try. Can I call you without the middle name? It's taking so long to get it right." Betty stroked the young artist's head and marveled at the softness from the working hair. In her mind, she had associated a hedgehog hairstyle with something prickly. The woman thought painfully to herself, "Poor thing. Her defiance of rejection is only ostentatious. In reality, she is like a lonely flower in the desert." Betty felt like clasping the girl to herself, but she was afraid to frighten her with such a display of affection. Meanwhile, Vanessa took out of the drawer a set of colored felt-tip pens, and the first thing she did was to paint their house. The creative process quickly carried her away, and soon a 4-legged shaggy creature of fiery colors appeared next to the empty booth. Vanessa painted and commented, "Sure, he didn't look much like Typhoon, but he was also ginger and very kind. When I gave him cookies, he always licked my hand. He didn't like candy. He would spit them out so funny. Vanessa laughed, and Betty was surprised to note that the girl's laughter was ringing like a bell. Soon flowers appeared on the girl's drawings, and the blue sky was filled with sunshine and white clouds. Throughout the creative process, Betty encouraged the little girl. "You have talent. Your drawings will grace any exhibition." Encouraged by the praise, the little girl confessed, "I can also draw people." "That's great. Do you want me to draw you?" "I'd like to, but you be my witch." "Okay." Betty agreed to let the girl paint her as a fairy tale character. Vanessa took a blank sheet of paper and set to work, although her sorceress turned out with slanted eyes. Overall, the drawing was positive. Suddenly the girl asked Betty, "Do you have children, a son or a daughter?" "I can draw whoever you want." The woman felt an invisible hoop with, gave her throat with. "Children." Aaliyah, without raising her head, suggested, "Then I'll draw myself." "You can, of course you can." Betty again barely restrained the urge to clasp that poor girl to herself. Her heart overflowed with unspent maternal love, and she was ready to share that feeling with the child. But there was a quiet creak of the door behind her. Betty turned around and saw the owner's aunt. It was an elderly woman who had not greeted her very welcomingly, and she tried not to catch her eye too much. And now Adriana was drilling her with her little eyes. "What do you do?" Vanessa grabbed her drawings. "Grandma Adriana, look what I drew. This is the house I will live in later when I am well. And this is my dog. She looks like a typhoon, though." The old woman made an effort, and a strained smile appeared on her face. "She does. And the one you pictured." Adriana reached for the second drawing. Vanessa began to cheerfully explain it to Betty. "She's kind, like a wizard. And I drew her beautiful." The old lady's inquisitive gaze lowered again at Betty to look like the original. Only sometimes even wizards forget that sick girls need to conserve their strength. Adriana headed for the door, and Betty was ready to fall through the cellular floor. She realized that the old lady was not happy with her and was very afraid that she would tell her master everything. "Vanessa, your grandmother is right. You should get some rest." "Girl, I'm not tired at all. I want to paint the sea some more. Daddy said that when I'm well enough, we'll go to the sea with him. I'll ask him to take you too, because you're good." Betty made the girl drink the medicine and then put her to bed. "You rest for a while, and then you and I will go out. We'll take a walk in the garden." Betty slipped out the door, but almost screamed in surprise when she bumped into Adriana. She realized that the old woman had been eavesdropping. In truth, the older woman was not the least bit embarrassed. "Betty, come into the kitchen. I have something to talk to you about." The strange behavior of this woman, as well as her manner of speaking even on the first day, caused surprise. It had been 2 months, and Betty was still not used to the peculiarities of the inhabitants of the house. Nothing. But she kept all her emotions to herself, as she treasured the job very much. More recently, there was another circumstance of reluctance to part with Vanessa. Betty did not understand why she was drawn to this girl, but it certainly wasn't pity. With those thoughts in mind, she followed Adriana. The table in the kitchen was set for 2. The old woman noticed the surprised look on her face and said, "I'm a living person too, and I'd like to have a word with someone. Don't be shy. Sit close to the table. We'll drink tea and talk." Betty timidly asked if I could help you. "Why?" "I'm all set. Why was I standing at the door, waiting for your class to finish?" "You used to be a teacher." Betty answered honestly. "Yes, I was, but it was a long time ago. I have very little experience." "Not even a year." Adriana shook her gray head. "I didn't earn my pension either. I spent most of my life with my brother. But I never made my own nest. I was married for only 3 years, then I closed my head and he left me. He found someone else, but it seems so was God-pleasing." The old woman poured tea into cups and sat down opposite Betty. "I couldn't leave Yannick alone. It's our custom to help the younger ones in the family. And Jan was the youngest. We're from a remote village ourselves. Our parents dug in the earth all their lives, and we were supposed to continue their work. But I didn't want to. He was different when we were growing up. He liked to stand out. His father beat him a lot, but he never got the bad temper out of him. When she graduated from high school, his father wanted him to join his brigade. But it didn't work out. His brother escaped through the window at night. My father almost died of anger. She shouted at the whole village that she would kill him with her own hands, but he didn't keep his word. When she found out that her son was studying at the institute, she and his mom went to the city every month with full descendants and then boasted, "Say, we have such a smart son who is going to become a scientist." Betty listened in silence, and the old woman suddenly realized, "You're probably not interested." "On the contrary, I'm very interested." "And what happened to your brother Adriana?" she shrieked. "Life is like a fairy tale. The beginning is exciting, it seems, then either boredom or misfortune. Nothing ever happened for us. My brother didn't tell me much about his business, so I don't know how he got rich so fast. But it's true what they say, money spoils people. I got angry too. He ruined his wife with his own hands. Everything was wrong for him. Everything was wrong for him. He calmed down a little when Eugene was born. And then she was gone. She died. And Eugene was left without a mom. And now Vanessa was just like him." Betty exclaimed in horror that her mother was dead too. The old woman crossed herself. "Lord have mercy. She's alive, as far as I know, but she's not much of a mother." Adriana looked warily at the door and then whispered, "I'd love to tell you everything in detail, but Eugene doesn't allow Vanessa to change her mother's name in this house. It was an unhappy love affair. She left him with her daughter and went to Europe. The front door slammed, and Adriana fussed all about the peace. The landlord's here. He doesn't like to be idle in his house. He's a bully in his office and here too. Even Vanessa gets a lot of abuse from him." Betty hurried to her room. She had only seen Grimes a few times in the entire 2 months. He had only talked to her on the first day, and that conversation had lasted no more than 2 minutes. The businessman asked about her marital status, checked her passport, and did not even look at her diploma. After these obligatory actions, he voiced the condition: "Betty, I trust you the most valuable thing, my daughter, so I hope for your decency. Of course, more from you I have no right to demand, but I will be grateful if a particle of warmth. Give it to my little girl. It's very important to her right now." Betty wanted to assure her master that she would do her best to care for his daughter. But Grimes left without letting her speak. He always returned home late at night, when Vanessa was already asleep. Betty therefore had no opportunity to tell him how the girl had spent the day. But she guessed that the ubiquitous Adriana reported everything to him daily as well. Of course, Betty was a little uncomfortable being a servant, but today, for the first time in 2 months, she felt real joy as she watched the gardener trimming the bushes from the window. Betty thought it's true what they say, love works wonders. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the baby gets better. And so she admitted to herself that she loved someone else's little girl. But this discovery did not frighten her, it only gave her confidence. She would try to stay in that house. And not at all because she had nowhere to live with nothing to live on. She really wanted Vanessa to learn to smile, not because she was asked to, but just to smile at the sun, at the birds, at the new day. Betty was well aware that it was not going to be easy their housekeepers with their strange notions. A mother who was missing a father who was always at work, and nothing contributed to making Vanessa happy. Even Adriana, who seemed to genuinely love the girl, seemed to be trying hard to hide her emotions. It's unclear why. Adriana didn't have time to put the table in order. Grimes caught his aunt on a hot broom. This one was quietly indulging in tea and probably played a couple of games. The old woman didn't even raise an eyebrow. She had long ago learned that the best defense is a surprise attack. "Why are you back so early? Or did you get bored with work and want some female companionship? Why do you look for other female companionship? What's so interesting about socializing with an old woman?" The man laughed, naturally, a relative in Adriana's arms. "You know how to get off an unpleasant subject. Judging by your reaction, I hit the mark. And how was the operation to recruit our nurse?" The old woman's lips tightened in a way that indicated her extreme displeasure. Nephew could be too perceptive when he didn't need to be, but when it was necessary to consider this Valeria, it was as if he had lost his mind. But it's also impossible to be in the same house and not notice each other. So you decided to be the first to step up. I hope Betty appreciated your good intentions. or did you find a way in?" The woman had already cleared the cups and plates from the table. "Eugene, stop talking to me like I'm an unintelligent child. I am almost twice your age and I demand respect." The man realized that he had said too much and wanted to enclose the aunt in his arms again. But she came back. "Sit down at the table, I'll feed you, because you with your work forget to eat normally, but as if you were 18. And you are far from 18 and it's high time to eat, right? And you're just joking around." "Yes, Comrade Marshall." Grimes jokingly saluted his aunt and sat down at the table. Adriana immediately forgot about all the offenses and put a bowl of soup in front of her nephew. No matter how old he was for her, he was always her nephew, a boy whom life had wronged more than once. "Eat before it gets cold. Betty and I just had tea. She doesn't leave her room all day, so I decided to give her a treat." Adriana hesitated and fell silent. She was skeptical that her nephew had found a nurse for Allie so quickly. How could she entrust her girl to an untested person? And Eugene hadn't even made any inquiries. But after a few days, seeing how Betty did not leave Golly, Adriana softened. But she didn't want to give up so quickly. "And what did you two talk about, if it's no secret?" "Oh, just a little bit of everything. She's a hothead too, and she's had a lot to drink. Her husband died and left her with a lot of debts. She had to sell everything, even her apartment. You know, I realized one thing. The better a person is, the harder life beats him. That's the pattern." Eugene with appetite flew away. Soups only occasionally gave in to Auntie. Life is such a thing that a man does not know where it will give him in 5 days. You don't expect anything like that. But then one day it's here. The man spoke in such a tone that the aunt unmistakably guessed that something had happened today that made her nephew change his habits. Adriana lowered herself into a chair and, in a heartfelt voice, asked Eddie, "Check, what's wrong? Or did she show up again?" "Adriana, I even crossed myself as if I'd said something bad." And her worst fears were immediately confirmed. Grimes sighed heavily. "Auntie guessed it. I don't know where you got that mind-reading ability, but you could make a living at it. Don't bother asking me questions. Things will settle down a bit, and I'll tell you all about it later. Thanks for the vow." "Adriana, I didn't press for details, just sighed, as long as it was healthy. You're not going anywhere else today." Eugene got up from the table. "No, I want to stay home. Maybe I'll take Vanessa for a walk in the park tonight. Betty was going to get some fresh air with her, too. They arrested her today. Can you admire your daughter's artwork?" The man's revitalized. "Let's see it. That's a positive sign. It wasn't the doctor who said it was advisable to keep Vanessa busy with exciting games or creative activities." Adriana held out the drawings to Vanessa. Grimes' gaze warmed. "Good for you, after all. This is Betty. Vanessa used to draw everything in black and white, but this is such a fountain of colors. Look, my artist even drew a dog. It looks like a typhoon." The old woman nodded in agreement. "Yes, it does. Eugene shouldn't have given the dog to his hunter friend. Vanessa was very worried. Maybe that's what gave her the disease. All the time Vanessa was sick, Adriana tried to find the cause. It seemed to her that there was a reason, and it had to be found and eliminated. Then Vanessa would get better right away. You and I have discussed this matter many times. Let's not go back to it." Grimes returned to his usual demeanor. He looked at his aunt with irritation and added that Betty, I will give her a bonus for her special diligence. Adriana muttered slowly, "You can't measure love and care with money. You should know that." Eugene looked at his aunt with an absent look and headed for his office. Today's meeting was unexpected and awakened in his soul not the most pleasant memories. Memories of things he would rather forget. Despite his tough temper, Martin allowed his only son a lot of things. If his wife and servants he kept in a black body, then Eugene could do anything that he occasionally gets into his head. After the tragic death of his wife, Millionaire especially succeeded in indulging his son. Any whim Eugene fulfilled immediately. It was worth only the appearance of a cell phone, like a son. Nothing was at the disposal of the coolest device. Eugene wanted to join the biker culture. Please get a bike with various technical contraptions. On the sole hair's coming of age. Martin celebrated with pomp, organizing a real show in his recently arranged country residence. The guests were entertained by famous entertainers, and the final part of the program was a fireworks display, equal in power and duration of fireworks on public holidays. The gifts also corresponded to the status of the event. But the main present, a sports car, Eugene received from his father. Like many newly emerged from the golden eggs, Eugene was fond of extreme entertainment. At night, he raced around the city on a brand new car together with a group of the same young inadequates. Several times the police arrested him for violations, but usually he spent no more than half an hour in the police station because his father's name had magical powers. But one day it stopped working. Then Eugene and his two buddies got drunk in a bar, and he was in a desperate need of fun. But on the night, streets almost ended in tragedy when one of the racers beat up a woman on a pedestrian. But thank God, the unfortunate got away with a closed fracture of the tibia and a strong fright. The perpetrators of the accident did not manage to escape and were taken to the police station. Adrenaline mixed with booze, still splashing in the veins of guys who openly threatened the guards of order. Eugene's making faces at the officer on TV2. Listen, now my father will come and build you all up. You're all flying out of here like a champagne cork. In the midst of such a performance, a drunken man showed up. When Eugene saw his father, he yelled, "Oh ho ho ho. Here comes Mr. Grimes. Get ready, you shameful cops." Martin whispered something to the officer on duty, and he opened the monkey house. It was like something out of a thrilling movie. Senior Grimes took his offspring out of the cage and beat him in public with a belt. As he did so, he loudly repeated, "Better late than never." Eugene tried to dodge the blows, but the natural leather belt hit him again and again. The most frustrating thing was that his helplessness was laughed at not only by the department staff, but also by his friends, with whom he had been nightmarishing the city together for many months. Through much persuasion, nothing to the elder and the fathers of other underdogs managed to settle the case. For a long time, the victim did not want to give in, but after a solid monetary compensation, all the same gave in. In order to teach his wayward son a lesson, Martin forced his son to act as a negotiator. Every day after school, the boy visited his wounded aunt in the hospital. He had to spend his pocket money on apples and oranges. Nina was a little shy at first, but did not refuse the guests. When I started to feel better, it turned out that she and her husband had been planning to renovate their apartment for a long time. But all lacked money, pocket money. A student for such a global event was clearly not enough, and Eugene had to bow at the feet of his father. Martin, with new dental implants, unbuckled the necessary amount, but he warned his son, "Let's finish the drudgery with this aunt. Otherwise, she'll be pulling money from us till the end. Let them give a receipt that we compensated her for the moral and physical damage." During the next visit, Eugene rolled out this condition, which brought Gennady to a state of tetanus. During this epic scene, Clara, the minor daughter of the victim, was present. She agreed to all the separation help. "Mom is dying." Of course, the entire staff also ran to this cry and wildly, rudely shoved her out of the ward. At first, the guy was even happy about this turn. Now that evil aunt would get off our backs. But Nina was not one of those who forget about unpaid debts. She showed up at the luxury village in a cab. She couldn't walk with confidence yet, so she leaned on crutches. The guards at first did not want to let the visitors in, but she began to scandalize. The elder Grimes had to resolve the conflict himself. As he approached the gate, Nina sang pitifully, "Martin, I thought you were a decent man. It's because of your son. I almost became an invalid. How can such callous people represent other people's interests?" Eugene's father immediately realized that this woman was extorting money. There was an election campaign looming, and Grimes' candidacy was on the list of people to prevent unwanted hospital action. He wrote her a check, but took a receipt. That was the end of the unpleasant story, and they soon forgot all about it. But a few years passed, and both of them had to remember the old conflict. "I had always had good health, but over the years it began to fail more and more often." Fearing a sudden departure, the man began to gradually hand over the business to his son. Eugene from childhood was accustomed to the idea that he was obliged to continue his father's business, so he quickly enough joined the business and even began to carry out some useful changes. The father was pleased with his son. The only thing that upset him was the prolonged bachelor period in his son's life. Many times he started a conversation with him on this topic, but each time wildly resolute cut him off. "Dad, and I'll decide when I get married. I'm not right for this step. When will you?" When the sand comes out of the same place, I realized I didn't have the power I used to have, but he had to accept reality. Sometimes he still dared to talk to his sister about his son's fate. Several times they tried to introduce the boy to promising brides from good families, but Eugene immediately recognized their intentions. "You won't get anywhere with those methods. Even if you get a good girl, the mere realization that it was a setup would turn me away from her." Since there was no other method of marrying my son, Grimes continued to try to introduce him to the daughters of his business partners. Knowing his father's intentions, Eugene simply stopped coming to his father's house. After graduating from the institute, he settled in an old city apartment. On that winter evening shortly before New Year's Eve, he was also relaxing at home in the company of friends. But Adriana 80 called. "We're in trouble. They took your father to the hospital badly. He collapsed during dinner. He was sitting there eating roast lamb, and suddenly he started falling over on his side. I was so frightened that I almost had a heart attack myself." Auntie said all this at once and asked Eugene to come as soon as possible. The young man rushed straight to the hospital, where he had a hard time getting permission to go to his father's room. The doctor tried to reassure him. "It's not a big deal yet. Your father's blood pressure spiked. His blood sugar's higher than normal, too. But it's stabilized now. He's resting." Eugene insisted. "I want to see my father. I need to make sure he's okay." The doctor gave in. He asked a young nurse to escort this gentleman to the 8th. The girl pouted her plump lips prettily. "Liam, if you mean Grimes, he's in our room. You told me to put him there." The doctor touched his pocket and then said, "Thank you, Clara, for the tip. Everything's slipping out of my head as I go along. I can't keep anything straight." The nurse smiled with the same charming smile and looked at Eugene. "Come on, I'll walk you out." Although the room for the selected patients was not luxurious, but here was everything necessary for a comfortable life, and they had a thing slept soundly, and his son did not wake him. The nurse touched the visitor's arm. "Well, made sure that your dad is all right?" "Yes, thank you." He hurried to the exit, but the girl stopped him. "Eugene, don't you recognize me?" Did he shake his head? "I didn't." "Have we met before?" A matchless smile lit up the girl's face again. "Yes, but that was over 8 years ago. We met, but at a different hospital. I came to see my mom." A hunch burned my brain. "So you were the one who was broadcasting to the whole ward. You almost got me thrown in jail." It was said by a young man with a sense of humor, and Clara immediately laughed. "I was just a little girl then, and I was very scared for my mom. So I started screaming like crazy." "And how is your mother now? How is her leg?" The girl was first surprised at what leg, but then remembered the circumstances of the incident in the hospital. "You mean the fracture?" Mom had long since forgotten about it. Eugene thought about the fictitious money. Probably she hadn't forgotten. But the young man did not speak out loud about it, because she considered it unethical in such a situation. Martin was in the hospital for almost a month. Eugene visited him every day, and every day saw Valeria in his father's room. This girl completely conquered the elder Grimes, who winking said to his son Eugene, "Look, what a girl is not the main doctor introduced her by a great favor. And thank him for this, because Clara brightens up my boring existence. Such an attentive, affectionate girl with no attitude. I wish I had a daughter-in-law like that." This statement was more than a hint. But in response, the boy only smiled. He did not want to admit to his father that this girl immediately fell into his heart. Eugene gave Clara gorgeous bouquets. Once he invited her to an expensive restaurant. After a romantic evening, they became very close in the truest sense of the word. But about the rapid development of their romance, sick father did not know. Therefore, Martin was very surprised when, after being discharged from the hospital, His son told him that he was going to get married. "Where did you find a bride?" "You were in my room half the day." Eugene replied cheerfully, "That's where I found my chosen one. By the way, it happened with your direct participation." The elder Grimes was pleased with his son, but Adriana did not like her nephew's bride. Without shyness, she declared to Eugene that's Clara, the dark horse. "Take a closer look at her. She's a con artist." Eugene then resented Auntie. "What is it with you and your branding?" "Clara is respected at work. The sick people also speak very well of her." The aunt did not argue with him, but remained in her opinion. She reminded him of her warning later when Clara sneaked out of her husband's house, leaving her 6-month-old daughter with him. Eugene went off his feet looking for his young wife, but Lara was nowhere to be found. She had left her job at the hospital right after the wedding, and her friends had no idea where she might have gone. The girl's mother was also completely in the dark. However, Nina did not miss the opportunity to blame Eugene for everything. Wives don't run away from good husbands. "If anything happens to the young girl, it's your fault." But Eugene was not confused and answered the hated woman in the same manner. "Your daughter must have forgotten that she is also a mother. If she makes herself known, remind her of that fact, and be sure to tell her that I will sue. A woman like that doesn't deserve to be called a mother." That warning had an effect, and literally the next day Nina, as usual, jumped in a cab to the house with some fanatical triumph. She told me Clara had gone to visit relatives in Europe. She called me yesterday from Brooklyn and told me she was going to live and study there. Eugene remarked sarcastically that you had never told me before that you had relatives in Europe. The woman blushed, and he realized she was lying. There was no point in talking to her further, so Eugene closed the gate in front of her. Nina came to her senses and shouted after him, "Yes, my daughter has a man who is willing to do a lot for her. He is not as stingy as you, Eugene, and she'll definitely take her daughter. As soon as she gets settled, she will come and take Vanessa to Europe." Eugene decided not to respond to this loud statement. That same day, he asked his lawyers to start the process for divorce and termination of Clara's parental rights. The next few months were filled with threats and curses. Clara would call him regularly once a week and talk trash. Like, "You'll regret doing this to me," when he asked for clarification on what she was putting him down for. Ex-wife was sending curses at him. It all boomeranged back on you when he stopped returning her calls. Letters started pouring in. Eugene had to take another case against his wife. After that, Clara calmed down. There was no news of her for 3 years. And then he learned that his ex-wife had gotten into some unpleasant trouble in Europe. Another 1.5 years passed, and Clara reminded him of herself with a phone call. She tearfully asked him, "Eugene, to turn to no one else for the sake of our little girl. Help me. I promise I'll pay you back." Not so much out of pity as to get rid of her, Edward transferred a small sum of money to his ex-wife's account. Surprisingly, Clara thanked him. However, as soon as he asked her where she was and what she was doing, the connection was cut off. When Vanessa grew up and started to ask about her mom, Eugene told her, "Your mom went camping in the mountains and got lost there." The aunt thought this was the right explanation. Let the child hope that mom would return one day. Only Martin could not get over his son's family drama. He blamed himself for not being able to see behind the beautiful appearance of the rotten soul of the girl. But it was possible that the deterioration of his health was due to entirely different reasons. The man was driving when he felt sick. He still managed to pull over to the side of the road so as not to create an obstacle on a busy highway. When concerned people tried to find out why the SUV was standing motionless for so long, the driver was already without signs of life. After the lavish funeral of the rich businessman, Eugene became the full owner of his father's company and his property. He led a rather modest lifestyle and contented himself with the company of Aunt. All the other servants young Grimes fired Adriana thought this decision was right. Why should we waste money? I run my own household. And to her credit, she was good at it, despite her age. Eugene appreciated his aunt's help very much and was more afraid of losing her than anything else in the world. So he did not tell her the details of today's meeting with his ex-wife. Clara was waiting for him at the entrance to the office. She had changed a lot, and again. Again, he did not immediately recognize her. "You've made it a tradition not to recognize me," the woman said with obvious bitterness. "That's because I don't have time to get used to you. You appear suddenly and disappear suddenly." He headed for the door, signaling that the conversation was over. But Clara hurried after him. "Eugene, I'm going to be a minute. You realize I'm here for a reason." "I do. What do you want from me this time?" "I want to see my daughter. I heard a rumor that she's sick." Eugene interrupted the woman. "You must have forgotten that you've been deprived of parental rights since the trial. And where's all this concern coming from all of a sudden? I will never believe that in your stone heart moved what is called conscience." Clara, often with eyes as if ready to cry. But this technique Eugene had learned well during their short married life. "Clara, stop acting out. It doesn't work on me. Tell me what you want and go away." She didn't have to beg and looked him in the eye. "Give me the money. I'm left on the dole. My common-law husband left me. What about Europe? It's an endless paradise." Clara lowered her eyes. "I was deported. I won't tell you why. It's not interesting to know before Siberia. You guessed it. Your personal life. Clara hasn't interested me for a long time, and I'll give you the money for the last time. You hear me? For the last time, leave me and Vanessa alone. It's better for us and for you." He had all the cash. What was in his wallet? But Clara grinned and said, "You're not getting off that cheap. You owe me a living because you have our daughter." Eugene had to give his ex-wife a promise that he would give her the required amount. He took a long time to recover in his office and then wrote a check and invited favors. "Maria, I have a very delicate request. Make a card for these personal details through our bank." Favors asked, "Who should I give it to later?" Grimes handed her a notepad on a sheet of paper. "You put it at this address here, but you show it to me first. I have to transfer money from my account." Maria wasn't used to asking questions of the chief, but she'd had to run similar errands before, with the door of the chief's office closed. She whispered again this brew was pulling money out of him. The young secretary jumped up. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. What did you say? Did you think you were working?" Favors I couldn't wait to call Betty and ask how she was doing. But since she was in the middle of a workday, she decided to do it later. That evening, Betty was surprised when the owner knocked on her door warily. She thought Adriana had decided to cement their relationship with another cup of tea. But it was Eugene who entered the room. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Betty, but Auntie told me in confidence that you and Vanessa were going for a walk." The woman managed not to be awkward and as kindly as possible replied, "Actually, there is no secret." All the more the attending physician advised her to be in the air more often. Again, the positive effects of a regular walk should not be underestimated. Vanessa began to revive little by little. Her drawings are becoming more and more brightly colored. "Yes, I had the good fortune to see her work today, and I want to thank you for your sensitivity to my girl. I'd like to give you a raise. You shouldn't. I don't work in your house for the money, although it's important to me now. Vanessa's health is far more important, and I don't care about your status." The man was embarrassed and hurried out of the room. Betty threw a light shawl over her shoulders and knocked on the girl's room. "Ale, you are ready." From behind came a ringing laugh. "I thought you wouldn't guess I was hiding." Vanessa clutched the teddy bear to her chest. "I decided to take the crowd for a walk, because he's been sitting at home for a long time." The nurse agreed. "Good, let the teddy bear keep us company. But you still need a little greenhouse. It's a breeze outside. You know you're not supposed to be molested." Vanessa's piled up in her sweater. "I'll be hot. No one wears warm clothes in the summer." Wrong answer. "See, I took a shawl too, 'cause I'm afraid it's drafty." There was a cheerful voice nearby. "Grimes, Betty, I'll be taken for a walk. You see, I'd even put on a warm sweater, because I am also afraid of draught since childhood." Vanessa banned with delight. "Daddy, you are healthy with us too." Betty did not notice the appearance of the master and was confused. Taking advantage of the moment, Valia ran for coats and returned to the place of gathering. "I'm ready. Let's go." Adults slowly passed Olzia along the shrubs and flower beds' unusual shapes. Vanessa was distracted every minute by birds and various insects. Daddy, look, what a beautiful butterfly. Oh, and there are such funny flower beds. Eugene said sadly, I must have missed something. My daughter acts as if it's the first time she's ever seen this wildlife. Betty tried to control the feeling of awkwardness she felt in the presence of this man. The main thing to notice in time is that a child of any age needs attention and love. And sick children are especially vulnerable. The man waved his hand in frustration. You're absolutely right. Like my father, business has always come first for me. My husband was also obsessed, but he never achieved anything in life. I haven't told you about you. It's a pity that good people are often unlucky. Betty laughed. Eugene, that's a dangerous theory. Everyone strives for success, but that doesn't mean you have to be a scoundrel to achieve your goal. I'm going in the wrong direction here. You know, I've had a lot of bad luck in my life. So by my flawed theory, I can safely categorize myself as a good person. That's comforting. For more than an hour, they walked in the park, which was created by the hands of Eugene's father. The man told the nurse about the adventures of his youth. He mentioned the time when his father had whipped him in public with a belt. Betty laughed heartily and also told funny stories from her life. By the end of the walk, the awkwardness was completely gone, and she gladly accepted nothing's offer to visit the zoo with Vanessa on her day off. I asked the attending physician, and he gave the go-ahead. He advised me to go at a time when the menagerie would be less crowded. Suddenly, Vanessa spoke up. Daddy's dog kennel is like a menagerie, too. I know we can't have a puppy yet, but at least we can see it. There was so much hope in the girl's eyes that her father didn't dare to refuse her. All right, we'll take everything to the shelter and even plant four-legged pets. All the good stuff. Alex immediately caught on to the idea. Daddy, can Betty and I go to the store tomorrow and get food for the dogs? You got it. Mike will drive you there and back. Betty remembered that her car engine was acting up and timidly asked, Oh, and I'm going to go to the car service too. May I, Eugene? Sure, Betty. Then you'll have to bring along our helpful Aunt Adriana for the full package. The next day, the team started packing for the camping trip early in the morning. Adriana fussed most of all slowly. Don't forget your mask. Otherwise, you can get an infection at the store and put on a blouse too. The elderly woman gave a similar instruction to the caregiver and the driver, so the gathering turned out to be long. Adriana enjoyed commanding so much that she, as a team, reached the city, offered a rational option to Betty. In order to save time, you'll go to your workshop and we'll go to the store lounge. Then we'll call and arrange where to meet. Betty didn't agree at first because she was worried. But our faithful aunt insisted. I'm not the enemy of my granddaughter. We can leave her in the car with Mike, and we'll go to the store and get what we need. Vanessa decided to make her own terms. I'll agree to stay in the car. If you take me to the dolphins later, a small dolphinarium not so long ago opened in the regional center, and many parents with children were eager to check in there. The adults found nothing dangerous in the girl's desire and agreed. The car service workers quickly fixed the problems in Betty's car, and she dialed the driver's number. Mike said that they had already managed to buy guests for the kennel and was currently at the dolphinarium. The phone was snatched from Michael by Adriana. Betty, you can go straight home. There's no need to go back and forth, wasting gasoline. We'll be leaving in about half an hour too. Vanessa made friends with a dolphin. You have no idea how excited she is. Betty had only once had experience with these charming animals, so it was easy for her to imagine the emotions of a sick girl. With such positive thoughts, the woman settled into her and headed back to the Grimes residence. She walked to her room and was just about to change her clothes when a suspicious noise was heard outside the window. Betty swung open the casement and peered out through the bushes. Something was hurting, and the woman asked fearfully who was there. Come out, or I'll call the guards now. There was another rustle, and then there was a woman's voice. You don't need to call anyone. I'll leave when I see fit. A woman of about 30 years old came out of her hiding place, and with an unkind look, leaving Betty, asked, Who are you? The nurse answered exactly the same question I want to ask you. Who are you, and how did you sneak into someone else's territory? The stranger grinned and pointed her hand to the sky. I'm one of those aliens only recently landed. Betty picked up the phone, much to the stranger's consternation. "I was just kidding. It's just that the township said you needed an employee." "No, you were misinformed. Wait, I'll walk you to the gate." Just then Grimes's car pulled up, and the woman disappeared as quickly as if she could actually move through space without the use of special equipment. Just in case, Betty went outside and examined the shrubbery where the stranger was hiding. But she found nothing suspicious there. Grimes was surprised at the nurse's strange behavior. "Betty, did you lose something?" Did the wave of embarrassment wash over her again? "No, I just thought there was something shiny. It happens. It's called optical deception. In the summertime, especially before sunset, you often see glints like that. But a closer look reveals that there is nothing there. This is how the rays of the setting sun play, so your worries are unfounded. Why don't you tell me about your trip to the city?" Betty talked briefly about the trip. "I didn't have to go out. I stayed at the car dealership. Vanessa and your aunt went to the dolphinarium. They should be arriving any minute." Betty remembered the mysterious visitors when the owner had already disappeared into his office. Soon the merry company returned from their walk, and Betty rushed out to greet them. She was very anxious for the girl, who was taking her first walk for so long in months. Vanessa looked tired, but happy, and after dinner she went to bed herself. Eugene, however, was eager to continue the evening. He knocked gently again. "Betty, I haven't bored you yet." "No, not at all. Ollie is asleep. She had so much fun at the dolphinarium." "Are you tired too?" No. Then I suggest we continue this evening." She caught his gaze and felt herself blush in the man's eyes. Betty saw something more than the usual interest, although she realized that one must not cross the line that always exists between employer and mere employee. The desire to briefly feel happy again won out. It had been a terrific evening. The two of them admired the crimson sunset, which, after sunset, gently descended on the surface of the river water and floated into unknown distances. Grimes put his arm around her shoulders and said dreamily, "Perhaps such moments are the most precious in life, because they make a person happy. Betty, you won't believe it, but I have never experienced what is called happiness. I'm approaching 40 years old. I, too, can count on my fingers the days I felt happy. Eugene, we should get back. I'm a little worried about Vanessa. Adriana will be worried, too. Thank you for this wonderful evening." Grimes, like a gallant gentleman, kissed her hand, which came as a complete surprise. That night, she couldn't sleep for a long time. The businessman's kiss burned on her hand with fire, and his words about simple human happiness sounded in her ears. The news that the businessman Grimes marries a simple nurse quickly traveled not only the elite village, but also spread throughout the city. Representatives of the secular community were openly indignant, believing that such a status of a young man should not connect himself with the bonds of marriage with a housekeeper. But the commoners of the maid's estate treated this event with restraint. The guards and Misha's driver whispered quietly, expecting that they would soon be brought changes. Adriana didn't see anything wrong. When Anna dropped by her for a moment to find out more about everything, she philosophically remarked that fate itself guides a man. It is she who forces him to make choices, so it is useless to resist her. Of course, I don't know how it will be, but Betty is a good woman. Anna had a different opinion on the matter. Your Eugene could have chosen a richer, younger woman. This Betty is about 40 years old, and they looked at her passport. What does it matter how old she is? It's not age that counts in a family, it's understanding. Eugene has changed a lot. Lately, I don't even recognize him. He became interested not only in his business, but also in his home affairs. And he started coming home on time. Vanessa, how does she feel about having a stepmother soon? Adriana shouted at her former companion. Don't you dare say such words here. After all, it is only thanks to Betty that the girl has made a recovery. Although the doctors warn that the disease can still bring surprises. But we all hope for the best. Betty hoped for the best. But she was panic-stricken that everything would suddenly disappear one day and she be left with nothing. One day she told Marianne, with whom they had become friends in recent months, about her concerns. She was shocked by her confession. Betty, you can't do that. Don't you realize you're setting yourself up for negativity? You're a smart woman and you have an education, right? Probably took the psychology course at your pedagogical school. But you yourself realize that theory is very far from life. It's just that you're used to waiting for a trick from life. You need to get rid of that. Do you want me to take you to a specialist to set your mind right? Oh no, I'll do it myself. I just can't get used to my new role. Well, you get used to a good thing. You can still enjoy your happiness. Maybe even give Ganna a son. Maria, I've already passed all my lost love, and I'll give it to Vanessa. You won't believe it. I'm so used to this girl, and it's been less than a year. Maria was thinking of telling her friend to watch out for Eugene's ex-wife. Clara, contrary to her promise, continued to pursue Grimes, and the man, to avoid scandal, transferred large sums of money to her account. This secret she revealed to Jenna, who was sincerely worried about the fate of their mutual friend. Jenna, imagine, It's on the Hulk does not give anything a break. Previously, she rarely appeared, but now strictly once a quarter requires money. Oh, we should warn Urka not to get into a puddle again. She won't suffer a catastrophe a second time. I wanted to tell her before the wedding, but I changed my mind at the last minute. She's so happy. I don't want to ruin her hopes. Both cronies attended the wedding, which was held in one of the best restaurants in the city. But Grimes hadn't changed since the ceremony. He still as carefully treated her and often gave flowers. In the fall, doctors allowed Vanessa to go to school. Betty took the girl to her and picked her up in the afternoon. One day she was a little late and saw Lou being led by the hand by a strange woman. She rushed forward and recognized the strangers. She recognized the stranger as the occasional summer visitor who hid in the bushes under her room window. Seeing her, Allie shouted, "Betty, this auntie told me she was my real mom." It's true. Apparently, the girl had experienced great excitement and cried. Betty held her close to her. "Calm down, my good aunt was joking." The stranger grinned insolently. "I see the nurse, you're making progress, has not only managed to get into bed with my husband, but has also turned my daughter against me." Just as quietly, Betty asked, "This is the second time I've seen you, and I have no desire to meet you. Once again, please leave our family alone." Vanessa was just beginning to come to life. For her, any stress is dangerous. The woman unceremoniously interrupted her. "I decided to cover for my child." "No, dearie, that's not going to work for you, is it? What do you want justice for?" "I want my daughter back. I can't live without her." "I think you should take it up with Eugene, not on the street." Vanessa heard everything and cried even harder. "You're lying. You are not a mom, all moms are kind, but you are evil like a witch." The woman tried to grab the girl's arm again, but Vanessa kicked her in the knee with her foot. The kick was painful, and Clara grabbed her leg. "That's quite a family you got there. Wait till you see what kind of paradise I've got in store for you." Betty ran to Vanessa's car, barely keeping up with her. The girl was not ready for such physical exertion and began to choke. Betty had to take her in her arms to get her out of the place as quickly as possible. In the car, the girl was breathing. "Betty, are you going to tell Daddy?" Without turning around, she replied, "Sure, I will. I also think I should write a report on this person. Maybe then the relevant authorities will take an interest in her, and she will lose the desire to poison people's lives." Eugene was shocked when Betty told him about the outrageous incident near the school. He told his wife about his first failed marriage and how he was being stalked by his ex-wife. "It's my own fault for letting it happen. But I thought she'd get bored one day. I mean, she's the kind of girl who'd do anything. You should have let her go right away, huh? You made a big mistake giving her the money." "I realize that now, but I don't know how to stop it." "Eugene, are you afraid of publicity? But you had nothing to do with it. Clara has promised to tell the world everything she knows about me, and as you know, everyone has things they don't want to make public." They spent the whole evening discussing what could be done. In the end, Adriana exclaimed, "You know, to me, the whole problem is not worth it. Clara is trash, and she needs to be treated like crap. What are you afraid of? Eugene? So they find out something about you and let you run your own business. You don't depend on anyone. And if you keep giving her money, she'll just bankrupt you. Of course, you have to keep Vanessa away." Make it so it doesn't bother her anymore. It's decided that Betty and Vanessa will go to the seaside. While Eugene dealt with his ex-wife, Vanessa stood on the beach barefoot. And every time a quiet wave reached her feet, smiling at how nice it was here, Betty smiled. Do you like it? It's only too bad Daddy couldn't come with us. But Daddy has a lot of things to do. He will definitely come with us next time. She put her arm around the girl's shoulders and they looked at the sunset for a long time. But what? Sleep tonight and tomorrow morning at the sea from the very morning. Vanessa nodded. Eugene called every evening and told her the news. Yes, Betty watched the news herself. Clara had been interviewed several times, trying to sling mud at Eugene. But they had thought this point out in advance, and the reporters asked questions that were uncomfortable for Clara. The apogee was the trial, which finally took place over Clara. She was facing several charges at once, and Eugene offered to disappear from the city, from their lives, in exchange for her freedom. She had no choice. To accept. But when she turned to her ex-husband, he hissed, "You're going to regret this a lot." And he, frankly, already regretted it. Realized that the respite, if there will be, then a small. But he was sure he wouldn't get any more of his ex-wife's money. There were only 3 days left till the end of the vacation, when in the evening Eugene didn't call. Betty tried to dial herself, but her husband's phone was out of range. She didn't call Adriana, sensibly reasoning that if anything had happened, her husband's aunt would have called her immediately in the morning. The phone was still unavailable. Betty dialed over and over again, but the robotic voice kept repeating the same thing. She was about to call Arcadia. Vanessa walked into the room. "Betty, let's just go for a walk today. I saw the market there. We should definitely buy some souvenirs for Adriana's dad and grandmother." There must have been something on Betty's face that made the girl ask worriedly what was wrong. "No, honey, it's okay, don't worry. Sure, we'll go and buy everyone souvenirs." They walked until lunchtime. Then, when the heat got too much, they went back to the room to rest. Betty could hardly contain her excitement and decided that she would call Adriana Millionaire right away. And where are you blown away? Betty and Vanessa stopped like a dumbfounded man. In their suite, Eugene was sprawled out on the couch, Daddy Eugene. Vanessa hung onto her father. Betty too, though honestly, she was ready to nail him. I mean, how can you have surprises like that? "I thought I'd surprise my girls. The girls have been out all day. I even got some sleep, and I missed you guys." With a glare from her husband, Betty realized his boredom was comprehensive. She was embarrassed, even though he and his wife were also on their last night out. Before they left, they walked along the beach, with Vanessa running ahead trying to find the prettiest shell. I look at her, and I can't believe it. Only 2 years ago, she never talked about anything but the fact that she was going to die. And I wanted to die myself. Do you realize, Betty, that you got us all out? Betty smiled. I could say the same about myself. I didn't want to live until I found you. Eugene raised his hand, suggesting we go to a local restaurant. Let's celebrate both our departure and the fact that we found each other so well. Betty laughingly agreed. It took Vanessa about 10 minutes to convince her to take only a few shells and empty her pockets. For the first month after we returned, Betty even jumped up at night. She was so afraid of Clara showing up again that she was unwilling to settle down. Eugene, looking at his wife's tossing and turning, decided to hire a security guard for his daughter. It was only then that Betty calmed down a bit. Though at first she was just winding up the guard, reminding him how he should guard Vanessa. The girl felt great. Only regular visits to the doctor reminded her of her illness. The examination was quick, though every time before it Betty was worried, so she couldn't eat. "Vanessa, we are going to the doctor tomorrow." The girl grimaced. "Not again, but again. What's the matter with you?" "You know it's necessary so the disease doesn't come back." "Yes, I know." In the morning, Betty woke up with a sore head. She wasn't surprised because it was almost always like this before an examination. Eugene looked at her and shook his head. "Betty, I sometimes forget that Vanessa is not your own daughter. Here, forget it completely." The man pulled her to him. "I'm so grateful to Anna for leaving us at such a good time. If she had stayed, we would never have met you. Betty smiled slyly. I guess we would have met anyway. Vanessa entered the office. The first said hello. The doctor smiled. I see, young lady. You're quite the adult, even without an escort. Vanessa turned around in surprise at the door. Where's Betty? The girl opened the door and immediately saw Betty. She was sitting in a chair, pale as snow, and looking at the doctor in front of her, who looked out along with Vanessa, popping out into the hallway fast to the ceiling. Vanessa watched in horror as Betty was carried down the hallway. Her strength was only enough to dial her father's number. Daddy. We're at the hospital. Betty isn't well. She's being wheeled away on a gurney. Eugene yelled that he was coming. And he passed out. He hadn't driven like that in a long time. Every now and then he heard the honking, but he only pressed the gas pedal to the floor harder. There was only one thought in his head. Just don't let anything happen. I wish it were nothing. Eugene saw his daughter at once. Vanessa looked so lost. Daughter, what happened? Daddy, I don't know. We were talking, and then I went to the study. Daddy, Betty's not going to die. Eugene didn't have time to answer because the doctor stopped next to them. Nobody's going to die. You can pick up your mommy in half an hour. Eugene stood up, looked at him. What's wrong with her? Doctor, please, I'm allowed to tell the whole truth. Vanessa held his hand tightly, as if supporting the doctor, smiled. I wasn't going to hide anything from you. I don't know, your wife took her diagnosis very strangely. I have a feeling she's a little lost. Eugene wanted to shake the doctor, but why say so many unnecessary and superfluous words? You could just name the disease Betty has. And then Eugene would quickly think of what to do next. Apparently the doctor sensed Grimes' mood, so he quickly said your wife is pregnant. Of course, we're a different kind of hospital. But that's something we can determine. Apparently, the look on Eugene's face made the doctor question his adequacy. There's nothing wrong with you. Why don't you have a seat? Eugene nodded, sat down, and only then looked at Vanessa. She smiled. Daddy, I'm going to have a brother or sister. Eugene seemed to let go. He jumped up. Vanessa spun around. Yes, can you imagine? We're going to have another Grimes. Vanessa laughed, fighting him off. Before they knew it, Betty walked up to them. She was looking at them and smiling. And she was crying too. Just a little bit, just a little bit. Finally, they noticed her. Eugene carefully set his daughter on the floor and walked over to Betty's wife. She lowered her eyes in embarrassment. I don't know. I wasn't expecting it. I thought I never would. Age, after all. Eugene laughed. What age? Look at you. You're the youngest and most beautiful. Betty, Adriana, Vanessa, and Eugene were waiting for the birth most of all. And she also noticed that Vanessa was not only very worried about her, but also distant in some way. She tried to talk to the girl about it, but Vanessa immediately walked away from the conversation. Betty didn't understand anything. She had hoped so much that they would become real family. But she couldn't find out what had happened and went to the birth with a heavy heart. Vanessa saw her off coldly. Before she got in the car, Betty hugged her. Alice Sunshine. What's wrong? I'm fine. Don't worry. You can't worry right now. I took a step back. It was only now that Betty realized she was jealous and thought about how she would be treated differently once the little one came along. When Betty got home with her son, Ali stopped approaching her altogether. So Betty decided to talk to her. Hello, can you sit down? The girl sat down, but she was tense as a string. I don't think you're happy to see your brother. I am. The girl was confused because she didn't expect such a direct question. And then we cried. I try not to think that you don't need me anymore. I can't. Betty sat down next to me. What are you doing, sweetie? I really need you more than I've ever needed you. They talked for a very long time. Betty scolded herself with the last words because she didn't understand how she could not have noticed such fears in the child. Let's take Daddy and go to the park this weekend. Andy, well, Andy is too young for that kind of fun. I think we'll have Adriana watch him. They just got to the third carousel and had one ice cream each. As Eugene then saw Adriana running towards them, Eugene and Betty. Betty stood up. The ice cream fell on the ground. Andy. What's wrong with him? She barely whispered those words. Adriana had already shouted them to Clara. She picked up Andy. Betty collapsed without feeling. Eugene grabbed the phone. All rushed to Betty. Betty, the woman, opened her eyes. She looked into Eugene's eyes. On ideas, I beg, 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 beg. Eugene, gritting his teeth. Clara showed up a week ago, said she was passing through, and would be very grateful if he would throw her some money, not as a favor, but as a friend. Eugene laughed in her face, said that if she did not disappear at once he would call the police. She screamed like a market wench, but she left anyway. He didn't tell Betty about it, so as not to upset her. He was sure Clara would leave, afraid to stay, so she didn't. The search had been going on for 24 hours. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. Betty had become like a shadow. She flitted about the house, then ran outside. Eugene was in a similar state himself. There was no way Clara could have disappeared unnoticed. Once again, they arrived at the house. Adriana jumped out to meet them, but immediately realized there were no results. The older woman felt guilty. After all, she was the one who had undersighted. She turned away from the stroller in her own yard for a moment. And then she saw Clara, who with a child in her arms got into the car. Adriana ran after her. She didn't have her phone with her, and the park was close. When the car disappeared, Adriana rushed into the park. The old lady turned around, then Tool, and wanted to go inside. When I heard that I'd trade your puppy for money. I'm sick of his whining. At the gate stood Clara. In one hand, she had Andy in the other barrel, which was pointed at the child. Her eyes were glittering feverishly. Clara is calm, and I will give as much money as you want. There was a car behind Clara. Eugene recognized the security guard who worked for them from the driver. So that's how Betty looked at Clara with crazy eyes. I'm going to interrupt you. If my son has been harmed in the slightest by you. Clara laughed. It's all your fault. If you hadn't come to work here, I could have come back. Ollie was crying quietly. Give me a little brother, please. Clara turned to her. Do you want to take the baby brother? Go get it. You're a brave girl. Alla took a step forward. Then another. She held out her arms. Betty said, Alla, stay away from her. But it was too late. The girl stood beside her birth mother. The latter handed the child to Vanessa and laughed, pointing the barrel at the girl. But now you can claim all the money. You don't feel sorry for your hubby and give all the money for them. Eugene waved his head. No, I'm not. Let them go and I'll give you everything. But no, I don't believe you. The money first. Betty saw that Vanessa had stealthily taken 2 steps to the side. A couple more steps and they would be able to block her. But Clara saw it too. But hear the little shit. She threw down the barrel and Betty jumped on top of her. The women went down. The last thing Betty heard was Vanessa screaming and gunshots. How quiet and good it felt. Betty is floating in some kind of boat. It's a beautiful sunset. She'd seen a sunset like this before. And it was at the sea when she and Vanessa went to the sea for the first time after her illness. Where Vanessa and Andy were. But now Betty just knew they were there, and there was no worry. How good it is when nothing hurts, neither heart nor soul. She was ready to bob on the boat all her life, if only she could feel as good as she did. Mommy, Mommy. Betty wrinkled his nose a little. Someone was trying to disturb her peace of mind. Why would she feel so good? But the voice was insistent. A sort of uneasiness began to appear in her heart. She was really bothered by that voice. She tried not to listen, to cover her ears, but the ringing voice swept away all obstacles. The boat rocked. All around her the waves rose fierce, and Betty was carried away. It hurt her heart, and for some reason in her shoulder, and I don't know which pain was worse. Mommy, please come back. We're so sick without you. My hand was burned by something hot. Betty was scared. It was tears. Vanessa's tears, and the voice is hers too. She calls her Mommy. The nervous tension was building. How many times had she and Eugene talked about this topic? Betty had said she really wanted to be Vanessa's mommy, but if the girl couldn't call her that, she wouldn't ask, much less insist. And Vanessa, no matter how close the relationship between them was, would always call her Betty. Betty was thrashing around. She could hear Vanessa, but there was no way she could answer. She had to answer because her little girl was crying tears like drops of fire, burning her hand. Don't cry, it's okay. Vanessa froze. Was she imagining it? No. Betty lifted her eyelids with difficulty. The doctor's daddy. Eugene sat in the chair and swayed. Andy, well, for a week now, they come here as a family and sit by Betty's bedside. Valerie, of course, had been curled up right away, but Betty's injury was very serious. She underwent 2 surgeries, but never recovered. The doctors gave no prognosis, and Eugene tried not to think about the bad. When they left Betty, they first went into the neighboring ward. Their Adriana was lying there after a heart attack. The whole business had been left to Maria Favors. In general, Eugene decided that when he returned, he would offer his press secretary to be his deputy and director. Because if it wasn't for her every day, she sent what she needed to take to the hospital. She wouldn't release anything from hygiene products to partner negotiations. The doctors kicked both Eugene and Vanessa out of the room. The girl was breaking down into sobs. "Daddy, say it's going to be okay. Say, Daddy." And he answered, "It's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. It's going to be all right." How could he possibly want to believe that? You can come through, but not for long. Betty needs a lot of sleep now. Eugene slowly stood up, looked at his daughter, then at the doctor. He smiled. "Your heroine is awake. I don't know what happened, but she just woke up." Betty asked her husband to lay down next to her. Tears slowly rolled down her cheeks with her hand. She held Vanessa lightly against her. "You, Mom. If you knew how long I've waited for this," she was crying too. Eugene was kneeling by the bed and his tears were flowing. "Woman, are you crazy? You can't get up, let alone walk." The family idyll was shattered by the loud voice of a nurse who tried to stop someone from entering the room. And then they heard Adriana 1 million in the left voice. "I need to get in there. Are you hiding something from me? You're not treating Betty well enough." The door swung open and Adriana appeared on the threshold, pushing a wheeled drip in front of her. Betty was the first one who couldn't stand it. She laughed a little audibly. Then Eugene. The picture really was like something out of a comic book magazine. A shot of Adriana tangled up with tubes, IVs, the tripod swinging gently, and a terrified nurse who just didn't know what to do. Following her father, Vanessa laughed, and even Andy smiled in his sleep. "Adriana, I watched everyone laugh for a while, and then proclaimed, 'Take this thing off me. I need to hug my family.'" Betty was on the mend. Eugene told me that Valerie had been declared sane and was about to go to trial, where she would get the full brunt of it. You know, for the first time in my life, I don't feel sorry for her. She almost robbed me of the most precious thing about you. I hope her brains will fall into place. Betty didn't want to think about Clara or anything else. She wanted to enjoy her life here and now with the people she cared about around her.
Subscribe and click the bell.
"Yes, I'm ready tomorrow," a young 19-year-old girl said. Her name was Julia. She was an orphan now. "Now, my dear," answered Grandpa, filling the various holes in the sewing machine with oil. "Well, it's going to last a year," Grandpa said, pushing it to the middle of the big folding table. "Oh, thank you, Grandpa," thanked him Julia, hugging and kissing him on the cheek. "Now for sure all the lines will be perfect," she exclaimed, running her hand over the sewing machine. "But everyone at the table." "The soup will get cold," said the girl, going to the kitchen. Maybe it will come out. What of it?" Grandfather scratched the back of his head, adjusted his shirt, and came to the table. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of freshly cooked soup. Salad from a couple of eggs, and with cucumber perfectly complemented the lunch. The grandfather and his granddaughter started the meal. "Oh, my daughter, with your talents you could go anywhere," said the grandfather, sending another spoonful into his mouth. "Well, just anywhere." "Pepper?" asked Julia and peppered her plate. "Yes, I guess so," replied Grandpa. Within minutes, the plates were empty. Without drinking her tea, Julia went to her room. She couldn't wait to finish sewing a woman's elongated shirt, a model she had designed herself. The girl sat down at the sewing table and straightened the shirt, the color of young grass. Joining the 2 pieces front and back, she made a couple of side seams, then sewed the sleeves together rather quickly and moved on to the collar. the case argued. The girl's hands themselves longed to hold the fabric between her fingers, fold it, pull it taut, and pedal the machine. Wow, it's just magic. Julia marveled every time. Then literally for a couple of hours in front of her was woven a new interesting thing from the material that had been lying in the closet for years. She got the fabric from her grandmother, and the machine was given to her by a neighbor for pennies. She took another one, new and modern. Then Julia received this machine practically as a gift. Her happiness was unbounded. Finding curtains in the closet, Julia could not resist and sewed herself a blouse from them. What was her grandfather's surprise when he noticed the familiar embroidery on the sleeve of the blouse, which his wife had once made to cover the iron-burned stain. "Wait, I can't understand," the grandfather said, scrutinizing his granddaughter's cover. "Where did you get this fabric? Isn't that our curtain?" Said he looked at Julia in surprise. Yes, Julia answered correctly, thinking it would upset the grandfather. "Well, Julia, you're crazy," he laughed. "But you are an artist." Laughing, grandfather laughed. It turned out cute anyway, he concluded. Then Grandpa went into the back room. After digging there for about 20 minutes, he came back with a gray suitcase with a padlock hanging from its handle. "I forgot to tell you," he began. "Here's your dowry," said Alexa's grandfather. "Let's see what we have here," he said, opening two locks with a small, almost toy key. Juliet eagerly waited to see what the lid of the suitcase opened. In front of Julia lay neatly folded different colors of fabrics in green, and blue, and polka dots, flower, and light and dense. "Wow!" exclaimed Julia, going through one fabric after another. "Wow!" she rejoiced. "Do you look? What a beauty!" The girl took the blue fabric and held it up to her. The color very well shades the tone of the face in Julia's head. Immediately began to pop up different options of what the dress could be. "Unbelievable, Grandpa. Thank you. Why didn't you show me before?" she asked. "And before, and there was no need," replied Grandpa Alex, and then, leaving his granddaughter alone with the dowry, returned to his room. He approached the picture, which was lying on his dresser, and ran his fingers over the face of the image. It was his wife, beautiful hair on her head and a noble smile. It was said that this woman had lived a good life, filled with love and joy. What cannot be said about Julia's parents who died on the airplane? They were on a vacation together at the time. Little Julia was left with her grandparents. When everything happened, Alex's wife couldn't take it and soon passed away. So Alex's grandfather and Julia were left alone. The grandfather took care of the girl, putting all the love and tenderness that the parents had to pass on to her. But Julia grew up a troubled child. She was an average student with little interest in anything. At first, she wanted to become a veterinarian, but having seen once not the most pleasant picture in the veterinarian's office, she was cut off. Grandpa didn't demand much from his granddaughter. He just wanted her to be happy and with wisdom to life and the world. Julia could not enter the institute on a budgetary basis, so she went to college to specialize as a manager. Strange as it may seem, but Julia graduated from college with a red diploma. That was the joy of grandfather Alex. However, it turned out that in life the manager is not the one about whom the students were told in the educational institution. And moreover, in already existing companies, so-called managers from the street are not needed at all. So Julia learned that in the real world, a manager is a salesman, and Julia did not know how to sell. And in the store to work in, the girl lacked the nerve and courage. She would have stayed that way. Julia would have been out of business if it were not for that neighbor who turned the wheel of fate for Julia. The sewing machine interested the girl very much. And it is not for nothing, because her grandmother and mother sewed very well. And with the availability of the internet, many skills and tricks for the willing open. Julia plunged headlong into the study of the rules of construction, varieties of stitches of different ideas. Now it was impossible to tear her away from sewing. At first, she often had to challenge the details and then sew again. One day, Julia was showing off to her grandfather Alex in her next blouse. "What do you think?" she asked with a twinkle in her eye. "Well, nothing so cute," answered Grandpa Alex. From his look, Julia realized that he was hiding something, that something was wrong. she asked, again going to the mirror and twirling around herself, examining herself from all sides. Seeing nothing, she turned to her grandfather again. "What?" she asked, looking at her grandfather, who was laughing with all his might. "Why are you laughing?" asked his granddaughter. "Oh, daughter, I can't understand why." "One sleeve sewn inside out," laughed grandfather, no longer holding back. Julia went to the mirror again. Now she saw her mistake. Yes, doing one thing for too long can have that effect. "Well," said Julia, "you know Grandpa. Nowadays it is fashionable to experiment." "So I tried it," replied the granddaughter, trying to keep a nonchalant look. "Well then, of course," replied the grandfather, and again rolled with laughter. However, over time, the girl burrowed and with not confused the facial side. Her skills increased. She stopped being afraid of the speed with which she sewed. Needed an electric machine. She learned to make even, beautiful stitches. Currently, Julia sewed for herself favorite and rarely on order for girlfriends and acquaintances. Since the girl did not know how to sell, she had to be satisfied with small customers. "You can post your work on Bequeathed or another social network, right?" suggested her friend named Christina. Julia thought for a moment. Christina went to the table and picked up the skirt Julia had made for her. "Wow, how did you do it?" she asked, examining the fox shape that came out in the fabric. "Manual dexterity and no cheating." Julia joked back. "Do not realize, Christina, how lazy to sit on social networks." Julia said wistfully. "Julia, I need to wear a skirt today urgently." She smiled broadly. Her eyes sparkled with fire. Christina spun around near the mirror, turned this way and that, and ironed the skirt and adjusted it again. "It's decided," she said. "Tonight we'll go to a cafe," said the girl, admiring her reflection. "But what cafe?" "Today I have to finish opening the curtains," Julia objected. "You know, Julia, to work well, you must first have a good rest," said Christina. And on her way home, she left. "I'll meet you at the waterfront at 4 p.m. And Christina slammed the door. Julia was left standing at a loss. On the one hand, she had work to finish. On the other hand, she hadn't been out for a month. She looked at herself in the mirror. There in the reflection stood a pretty girl of medium build. Her white skin spoke of the fact that she rarely ever got out in the sun. Brown eyes, plump lips, and blonde hair. Clean-cut hair made Julia's face and herself a very even attractive person. The girl fidgeted at the mirror, then pulled her hair up and made her lips a tube. "Yes, I'm still growing up to Christina's confidence," she said. Then pulled out a summer brown and white polka dot dress. She had made it in the winter, but had never worn it. The dress emphasized Julia's figure very well, which had a slightly fuller veda and hips and sides. But this did not make her look worse. On the contrary, her slight fullness gave her a certain charm. "Grandfather, I'll go with Christina. Let's take a walk a little, because my head is spinning from sewing," she said, looking into the hall. Grandpa Alex read scientific literature. He liked to be interested in different theories and new views on life. Grandfather put the book aside. "But good," Grandpa Alex said. "Take some money," he said, holding out $10 at the cafe. "Maybe come in or to the movies," he said. Julia wanted to refuse at first. After all, Grandfather and so much does for her. But remembering about the buttons she bought for the new order, she agreed. "Thank you, Grandpa. You are so generous and kind." Hall, wrote her granddaughter, approaching her grandfather and hugging him by the shoulders. "Well, you will be enough to hang." Ami joked grandfather, screaming under the weight of the girl. Julia blurted out a smile and disappeared behind the door. Walking through the courtyard, she walked out towards the bus stop. The house they lived in was in a gardening community that was located near the city. It was surrounded by forest, fields, clean and fresh air. Julia liked this place. The bus came up on schedule, and the girl jumped into it. All the seats were taken. But in such a situation, it always turned out that someone always gave her a seat. The girl caught the eyes of women and men. To be exact, not on herself, but on her outfits. While riding the bus, the girl would casually leave business cards with her phone number. I can't say it worked, but it gave her hope that people would recognize her. "Wow, that's quite a style." Christina exclaimed when she saw Julia in her new dress. "What an incredibly beautiful polka dot. You did not show it to me." Indignant girlfriend. "No, I did. Just you do not remember," answered Julia, at the same time Luba from her work on Christina. "Awesome. Well, let's go to her," said Christina, as if she were the most beautiful girls in the whole world. "Let's go for more eye contact," Julia replied, playing along with her. Christina was the kind of person who is always confident in herself. They know their worth and know what they want out of life. Well, or at least outwardly give that impression. Nevertheless, Julia enjoyed talking to her. She was lively, interesting, fearless, and besides, it always amused her. "Oh, I'm tired of work. I don't know where to put myself," Christina said, as she and Julia walked through the city along the waterfront. "I'm so tired of talking to customers. Show this one to that one. Explain to that one. We'll redo it." "Oh," she stretched out, complaining about the fatigue of work. "But I want to be weak and defenseless." She did not have time to finish. A nice-looking guy with a small black briefcase walked in front of her. Christina smiled at him, and with a puzzled look on her face, she suddenly asked him if you could help me. Christina handed the guy a closed bottle of water. "It was too strong," she said, lifting her left shoulder slightly upward. "Anything for you," answered the stranger, and taking the bottle from her hands, twisted the cork, then handed it back to Christina. "Thank you. You've been such a help to me." Flying Christina threw short glances at the guy. "Glad to help," the man replied and continued on his way. Christina watched her lips in frustration. "What man?" She stretched out, glaring at him. "Which one?" Julia interrogated her, as if she didn't know what she meant. "Let's go alone," said Christina, making a few glacis, lighting up the waters. The summer day was warm and even hot. Only a hat saved them from the sun. The wind played in the leaves of the trees. Passers-by were in a hurry. They were buying ice cream, walking with children. The fountain was growing, letting the water jet high up, then falling, stopped for a few seconds. "It's beautiful here," Julia asked, enjoying the walk. The girl looked around and was glad that she could just walk with her friend and talk about nothing. Of course, who spends most of his life in the forest? "Everything seems beautiful to him," Christina replied, making eye contact with a passing man. To a stranger. "Listen, because of your fox on your skirt, everyone looks at her and not at me. That's not fair." The girlfriend was outraged. "Or maybe not on the fox, but on your lovely thighs," said Julia. Christina was much scarier than Julia. Her figure was really enviable. Christina thought, maybe. She stretched, and they walked forward again. After 2 hours of walking, the girls were a little tired. The sun was getting too hot. It was time to go to the cafe. The girls made their order. Julia retired to the ladies' room. Walking back, she heard behind her back the girl, "Would you be kind enough to bring the 8th order?" Julia turned around. At the table sat a young guy about 25 years old. He smiled sweetly and showed something with his hands, trying to convey to Julia his request. "Yes, over there," he repeated, pointing to the steam table. Julia looked over there as well. There was indeed a tray of food standing there. The girl raised her hand to her chest and silently, "I asked." The guy nodded his head in response. Julia decided that this guy needs help, so she calmly went to the bar and took the tray with the order, and then carried it to the 8th table. "Thank you very much," replied the stranger. Julia furrowed her eyebrows. "But I'm not a waiter," she said, finally realizing the guy was playing a trick on her. "I know, but thanks anyway." As if nothing had happened, he replied. Julia, who had just been taken advantage of, could not hide her surprise. "Aren't you being a little insolent?" Julia asked. He asked her. "It's just a small request," and that's all the stranger replied. Julia was even more indignant at his answer and looked away from his blue eyes. Coolly under the nose, in which stood various delicious things. "Then I have a small favor to ask of you too." She mumbled to put on a smile. "Yes." "And what is it?" asked the one, sending a piece of meat into his mouth. He began to chew it as if he were the king of the earth. "And I owe you a little dessert," Julia said, and took from under his nose cakes with whipped cream. "Hey," squealed the guy. With your figure, I wouldn't make such a rash choice, smugly said the guy and again dipped the meat in the sauce. Sent it into his mouth, and indeed, answered Julia. And with her other hand took a plate with a big mound of vegetable salad. And wait. He indignantly tried to stop her. But Julia did not turn around and return to her table. Have you decided to watch your figure? Asked Christina, seeing a plate of fresh vegetables. I decided to watch the people around me, Julia answered, and then began to eat a juicy salad. The guy who had recently lost his order, resentful, sat at the table. He was surprised and at the same time admired the way this brave girl fought back against him. However, he couldn't afford for anyone but him to be able to respond to him so cavalierly. The boy was slightly nervous. Finally finding something to say, he walked over to their table. I apologize for interrupting your meal, he said to the girl. Christina's face glowed with a divine light. She listened to him, flapping her eyes. But I must inform you that this is my order. I paid for it, the guy said. Yes, I know, Julia answered calmly, putting the last slice of tomato on her fork. Christina followed the developments carefully. The guy called for the waiter. There's the girl, she took my order for herself, he complained to the cafe worker. The waiter stood at a loss, not knowing what to do. He asked for a receipt of payment. The guy began to look for the check, and not finding it, began to try to explain to the waiter the reason for its absence. While Julia calmly handed this check to the waiter, young man, I ask you to think of another, more intelligent reason to meet a girl, replied the cafe employee and left the company. The guy stood there with his mouth open, but when he saw that everyone around him was looking at him, he pulled on his jacket and, saying goodbye, left the cafe. The girls calmly continued their lunch. What happened to impatience? Asked Christina. You know, I really need to get out into the city more often, Julia answered, starting to eat the cakes. The friends laughed. After the walk and the cafe, they went home. Julia started sewing again. At this work, she calmed down and felt a good feeling inside. She liked working with the material. She liked the way the machine began to sew in her hands. Until a couple of years ago, there had been things between them. And disagreements. The machine was spitting now and then, the stiletto tangled threads, and once it just stopped and stopped sewing. Julia long persuaded her to return to work, until she discovered that the machine was not connected to the network. But that's all in the past. The girl skipped. What did you decide on in the plans? She was satisfied with the job done. The phone rang. Julia picked up the phone. A female voice said Julia. Julia, hello. It's Wendy calling. The thing is that I can't wait long for the curtains to arrive by parcel. My nephew is picking them up. Okay, she asked. Her voice was friendly and energetic. Yes, good. They are ready. Can you come over? Julia replied. And he would also like to make a shirt for himself. Actually, it's my idea. I found the material. He's bound to like it. He's a bit of a nuisance, but that's okay. I want him to have a memory from his auntie with them. Please, from him Measures asked her politely. Okay, we'll do everything. Don't worry, Julia replied, knowing that this kind woman always pays well and is always satisfied with the result. An hour later, there was a knock on the door. Julia did not expect such a quick arrival. She opened the door and then went to pack the curtains. Well taken and alive, pronounced the nephew. I now shouted Julia from the room. Yes, we got in, she replied, stepping out into the hallway where her nephew was waiting for her. Julia, reaching through the curtains, looked up. In front of her stood the one with whom she had just yesterday quarreled. Hello, said the girl. Good afternoon, said the guy, drilled Julia cold blue eyes. There was silence. So you're the one who sews to order? He asked timidly. Yes, that's me, Julia replied, feeling extremely awkward. But what my aunt asked you to take my measurements, said the guy. Yes, of course, we'll do it right away. Julia replied kindly. Tell me your name, she asked. Max, he answered. And then he added, nice to meet you, Julia. He looked at the girl. Likewise. Without any intonation, she replied. When the measurements were taken and recorded in the magazine, Max was about to go home. Look, Julia, nice shirt off his neck. He's a nice guy, Alex's grandfather said, extending his hand in greeting. Max was a little confused. He didn't expect to see a gray-haired old man here. Then he shook his hand in return and went back home. From that day, Max and Julia began to meet, but they were not of a personal nature, but purely business. Before that, only one male customer had come to Julia, and that was an old friend of Max's grandfather. Julia was worried that because of the conflict in the cafe, Max would try to hurt her, but still she hoped for his judgment. Max was from a very wealthy family. His father worked as a lawyer and was highly regarded, and his mother was a bank manager. Growing up, Max did not need anything and always got what he wanted. He was the only child in the family, and therefore all the attention of both parents went only to him. In addition, he had an aunt, which Sol and him Nechaeva. She herself had 2 daughters, so Max was a favorite and spoiled child. He wanted to go to this institute. You're welcome. Didn't work out with the teachers. No big deal. We'll transfer you to another one. You want your own business? Try it. Here's some money for you. Need a car, please. A club to relax in. Son, you don't look so good today. Get a massage or go out with your friends or something. You haven't bought yourself anything in the last month. But go get money, hopefully, his mother said. Max lived a carefree and trouble-free life, surrounded on all sides by love and care. Max's parents did not hurry him to get married. They thought that it would be in time. When Max first appeared in Julia's house, he was extremely surprised by their modest dwelling. A narrow corridor, a small hall, and 2 almost 3-meter rooms. That was the end of their living space. How Julia managed to place a small corner to live, it remains a mystery after meeting Julia. Max was struck by her ability to be happy being in such conditions. Yes, there was a forest nearby, clean air. But still, in his opinion, it all looked kind of shabby. But despite that, Max wasn't going to get away with it. Such inexcusable behavior of the girl in the cafe. So every time he went to the shirt fitting, he kept complaining about the tightness in his shoulders, the width in his chest. One time he got seriously pissed off when he saw what the buttons on his shirt would be. What are those? Asked Max, coming to Julia to try on buttons for your shirt. Julia replied, as always in her calm tone, which caused Max to be even more annoyed. Do men's buttons look like that? Max asked, crossing his face in bewilderment. What do you think they should look like? Asked Julia, realizing that the guy was being picky. How do I know what they should look like? Isn't that my concern? He exclaimed, picking up one of the small white buttons and scrutinizing it closely. How does it look like a man's? Julia asked wryly. At that moment, Alexa's grandfather entered the room. But how is our boy happy here? He asked, looking at the shirt on the boy. Max looked from the seamstress to the grandfather and back again. Then, after a little silence, Uncle Alex answered. It's fine. Everything is fine with me, Max said, pulling a smile as wide as possible. Well, that's great. We've decided on button. Quickly concluded Julia to record the customer's consent in front of witnesses. Despite the fact that Alexa's grandfather was already quite old, he inspired Max respect. If he could joke with Julia, then at the sight of Alexa's grandfather, all the dope from him flew off in an instant. The guy felt awkward around him and even felt some weakness of his character. What could not be said about the old man's short haircut, gray head, tanned skin? Always well dressed. Alexa's grandfather commanded respect. His dark brown, almost black eyes, staring at me point blank, made me feel fear. Already tomorrow morning I will be able to send your order to the address. And this is where we can say goodbye to you. Max. His name sounded special to her. Why send it? I'll pick it up myself, said the customer suddenly, looking at Julia. And then, to conceal the reason for his arrival, he added, I don't know. All right, as it will be convenient for you. Grandpa Alex, please escort the guest. Angelic voice asked grandfather-granddaughter. He fulfilled her request. Max, from me. Alex was a little confused about the denouement and the end of their joint project. It was as if he did not want to say goodbye to the girl. The next day, the same grandfather Alex opened the door to Max. Good afternoon, Grandpa Alex. How do you say hello with a cheerful mood? Asked Max. Grandfather, extending his hand to the guy, replied that everything is fine, except that the sewing machine again became capricious, said the grandfather. It needs oiling. His smile made the wrinkles on his face sharper, but from this his face was still as kind and friendly. Yes, technique as a woman requires attention, Max added, waiting for Julia to come out, but she still didn't show up. You've obviously come for a shirt, asked the grandfather. I'll get it in a minute, he said and disappeared into the workshop. Max was a little puzzled because he had hoped to see Julia. Here you go, said the grandfather, handing the guy a box that contained his new shirt. Thank you. Slowly, Max reached out. He held the box in his hands, twirling it around as if stalling for time. Then finally asked about Julia. Not her personally. Grandfather often called his granddaughter that. She went to town to the sewing store to buy thread, and she called out some names. Said she would only be there in the evening, replied Alexa's grandfather. Max was a little upset. He wanted to see the girl, but it did not happen. Having said goodbye, he left. When he returned home, he felt a strange feeling, a strange longing settled in his chest. An unfamiliar desire to see this girl had crept into his head again. He didn't think their meeting would end so quickly. The girl named Julia was definitely not what he was used to meeting in his life. Usually ladies themselves try to be the first to get acquainted with him, to become his girlfriend, to try to please him, to surround him with their attention and affection. But in Julia's life, there was a case that replaced her all around. He realized it immediately from the very minutes when she began to take measurements from him. Her gaze was soft and at the same time focused. It was interesting to watch her. When she was calculating the formula, at that second, she was looking directly at him. But it was as if she herself was somewhere else entirely at that moment. And when she grasped his wrists to take another measurement, Max felt the warmth and tenderness of her hands. But her grip was firm. As she grabbed, so she grabbed. Max sat down in the chair. He did nothing but stare silently straight ahead. For the first time in his life, he thought about how much passion this girl had in her life, how much she loved her work. This was something Max had never experienced before. He had never taken his endeavors seriously. He barely had time to start, but after a short time he lost interest. The very meaning of his endeavors and business projects lost interest. He realized that Julia was much stronger than he was, or rather her faith in herself and in her business was much stronger than she could imagine. Max slowly swayed both back and forth. At the moment, some realization was taking place within him about himself and his life. At that moment, the door to his room swung open, and a dog named Herman jumped into his lap at a run. The hunting spaniel, seeing his favorite friend, began to lick his face frantically. Max, by inertia, leaned back more than necessary. The chair lost its balance, and the guy with the pet in his arms fell on his back. The spaniel was frightened for his friend and started licking Max's face with renewed vigor, trying to bring him to his senses. Herman, no, stop it. Max covered himself with his hands, trying to keep the dog at arm's length. Ah, Makamai, what's wrong, son? The mother appeared in the doorway. Max looked at her upturned figure. Are you not mistaken? Concerned? She asked. Max, shouting and overcome by the unbridled tenderness of the dog, rose to his feet. No, Mom, it's fine, he replied. Falling to the floor knocked a little of the homesickness that had come over him. We have important guests coming for dinner on Friday. We need your presence. She spoke, moving closer to her son and stroking his cheek. I love you, son, she said. There was greed in her eyes, as if she wanted more of her son's love in return. Okay, Mom, I love you too, Max replied, looking at his mother. The woman was her name. Nancy was slender and beautiful, and she was the envy of young girls. And no wonder, for she took great care to look after herself. Her white skin color gave her even more coldness. Blue eyes, like two shards of ice, piercing her gaze through. And only a slight smile on her face spoke of her good spirits. Nancy liked to wear her hair up high and always wore high heels. She often changed her closet daily, buying more and more outfits for herself. Nancy looked at her son's clothes. Her face wrinkled a little. Then she pulled out the cash from her purse and handed it to her son. Take something for yourself. You can't go around in the same clothes for long. It can lead to depression," she said, and then left his room. The spaniel followed her, claws clattering on the parquet floor. Max looked at his shirt. It was covered in wool. The boy took it off and threw it in the basket. Looking at the box he had brought from the neck up, he took the lid off. Inside was a blue shirt, and on top of it a small candy bar with wishes for a sweet life. An involuntary smile touched his lips. "I think she likes me," thought the boy. Worn fully, he headed for the shower. The day came when the Max family hosted guests. The cooks had prepared an amazing meal. Champignons in cream sauce molded from the lower meat, many different salads, and much more. Everyone was already gathered around the table, only Max was late. Instead of going to the store, as his mother suggested, he went to Julia, who this time was not at home. He even decided that Alexa's grandfather was deliberately informing him of her absence. "There's our son," exclaimed Nancy, as soon as he appeared in the living room. There were bright lights burning all around, candles lit. A couple of gorgeous bouquets of roses adorned the room. Nancy walked over to her son, put her arms around him, and whispered in his ear, "Here is the deputy's daughter. She has to like you. Understand?" She whispered, barely moving her lips. Max answered her with a smile, then smiled and said hello to the others. Taking the seat across from the deputy's daughter, Max began to put food on his plate. There was silence. Noticing the slanted glances, Max smiled broadly again and then complimented the girl. "Cindy, are you so charming? I'm glad I had the opportunity to dine with your family," Max said. The girl's name was Cindy. She looked a little old. Or maybe she was just tired of acting like a girl from an important and wealthy family. Her overly elongated face, long nose, thin lips made her expression slightly repulsive. She gave the impression of a crybaby when she smiled. Her thin lips, threads of sparkle, appeared in a strange line resembling a horizontal comma. Her small, short teeth seemed to betray her shrewdness not only in food, but in everything else. "Thank you," replied the girl with a pronounced net. Max almost laughed. He could barely contain himself, stuffing a piece of sealed duck into his mouth. Dinner had begun. The guests piled treats onto their plates. Conversation ensued. Max watched the guests occasionally when his gaze would come across Cindy's eyes. The girl immediately began to flirt. During another of her smiles, Max managed to see a cucumber, tire root sticking out of her cheek. It looked quite funny. "Yes, our daughter is like a diamond to us," her father used to say. "She is infinitely talented and very intelligent. She often amazes me with her imagination." The father praised his daughter. "Yes, you can tell," Max said, which caused a new wave of stares. "I wanted to say that the beauty of a man is expressed in his imagination and mind, and he was slow in beauty," he finished, trying to keep his mask of touching and frankness. "That's so sweet," Nancy said, stepping on her son's toe with her heel. Max, eyes bulging with pain, slowly turned to face his mother, and then displayed a grin of white teeth. "Our daughter graduated from the High School of Mathematics. She also plays the piano beautifully," Cindy's mother told her. "Asia, play us something." She turned to her. "I'm not sure, but I'd be happy to," she said. And there was that funny sound again. The girl sat down at the piano. Her thin and sparse hair barely covered her shoulders. Her thin fingers went down on the keys. The girl looked at the guests once more, and then winded her hands on the keys. A dog waltz began to play. The two families listened patiently to the performance. Smiles were pasted on their faces, and only the spaniel, Herman, unable to bear the falsity, began to forget at the top of his voice. 2 minutes later, applause broke out. Joyful Cindy returned to the table. "What do you say?" His mother asked Max a question. "You know," Max replied, nodding his head. "I like the fun one," he said, and met his mother's cold gaze. "I mean, it's cheerful." The boy got out of it. When dinner was over, Max could breathe out and be himself. Nancy and her husband William saw the guests off outside. Max picked up a grape and tossed it toward the ceiling. Caught it with his mouth. Herman, even though he didn't eat grapes, he still envied the guy. The next day, Max went to Julia's again under the pretext of sewing another shirt. Julia talked to Max in a businesslike manner. Together, they discussed the color, the style, and also the buttons. When all the details were discussed, Julia said, "Well, I have to work. As long as I have orders, I have to keep up," she said, waiting for Max to leave the house. The guy stood at the entrance and nodded. He hesitated. He wanted to tell her something, to offer her something, to meet. But his lips were frozen. Max called out to Julia, seeing that he was out of focus. "I have to work until next week's meeting," the girl repeated. Yeah, I got it. Could you just give me one more second?" Finally, the guy blurted out. Julia listened attentively. "Thank you for the candy bar." "It was my pleasure," he said. "Yes, it was my pleasure," Julia replied, waiting for the customer to leave the house. "Have you decided to make up for the incident in the cafe?" asked Max. That the girl laughed. "No, I give all my customers a chocolate bar. It's my trick, like a sweet compliment," Julia explained, making Max feel uncomfortable. Once again, she was the smart one. "How about we get together? Unexpectedly for a girl?" he asked. Julia looked at the guy confused. "I'll take you for a walk into a cafe," Max explained. By this time, Julia had already realized that she liked the guy. However, at this point, she genuinely didn't know if she should accept. "We'll just go for a walk. We'll talk and eat. And then I'll bring you home," he continued to persuade. Well then, maybe Monday is my free day," the girl replied. Having agreed on this, the couple said goodbye. After the meeting on Monday, Max and Julia met on Wednesday, and then again on Monday. During the walks, young people talked a lot on different topics, sometimes argued and fooled around. Once Max invited the girl to drive his cool and beautiful car. Julia agreed out of interest. She had never ridden in such a car before. Max drove out on a free highway. The road was smooth and wide. The visibility was great. "Do you want to learn how to drive?" he asked, raising his sunglasses to his forehead. "No, I'll have a driver," cheerfully replied the girl, removing strands of hair. "Well, at least for a change," Max insisted. He wanted to surprise Julia and teach her something new. "Come on, I don't mind," agreed Julia. The car stopped on the side of the road. Max took off his glasses and looked at Julia carefully. Her copper eyes and blonde hair made her particularly attractive. Max lowered his gaze to her plump lips, but there was no easy way to get close to this girl. She loves and really values herself. Julia moved into the driver's seat. Max took her seat. "So watch," Max began. "You press the brake and clutch at the same time." Julia did as he said, now turning the key release, the brake, and slowly hit the gas. Julia was focused. The car moved. "Get out on the road and drive safely. Just don't go over 80, he warned her. Julia obediently followed his instructions. The asphalt quickly went under the wheels. The girl felt the pleasure of the process. "You're looking good," Max remarked, surprised at the speed with which she was getting up to speed. The wind ruffled her hair. The car glided smoothly down the road. The kilometers were behind them. Keys turned. To the left of the steering wheel, Max commanded. "And don't forget to turn on," he added. Max kept his eyes on the road and glanced at the girl behind the wheel. She was very beautiful. The green belted shirt looked stunning on her. Max caught himself thinking he was hooked. Julia had indeed gotten used to the simple rules quite quickly. On a free highway it was easy. But now the car behind them began to overtake their car. It passed very close. Max heard a grinding sound in the passenger seat window. A familiar face of the girl he used to spend time with peeked out, but then disappeared without a trace. She held her hand up. There was something metal clenched in her fist. Max realized that she had stolen his car. The hooligan's car sped forward. Max felt a rush of blood to his temple. He went into a frenzy. He tried to calm himself down, but instead he shouted "Equalizer" at him. What Julia, who was already driving at 100 kilometers per hour, did not understand. Catching up with them, Max repeated, unable to find a place to sit in his chair. Julia pressed the gas pedal and the car started to pick up speed. Then Julia decided to get closer to them and turned the steering wheel to the right. Max saw his car driving straight at the offenders. He was scared. "Stop," he screamed. "What are you doing?" Julia, not realizing what was being asked of her, she took her foot off the pedal. The pursuing car began to slow down. "What's going on?" Julia asked him again. "I didn't have much time left. I wanted to get closer to them," she explained. Max rubbed his forehead. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Aggressive driving is not encouraged," he said. "I'm sorry for what I did." "Who are these friends of yours?" Julia asked, parking on the side of the road. "Yeah, you could say that. I'm sorry I confused you," said Max. Then he got out of the car. In front of him were 3 long stripes, shimmering in the sun. Max raised his head with his hands and then got back behind the wheel. "I would not like to participate in such a showdown," said the girl. "It's not good for me." Julia was right. And Max realized it, but it was too late. On the way back, Julia drove again. This time, the straight road was replaced by tight loops that never seemed to end. "Pull over," Max said, but Julia kept going at a steady speed of no more than 40. "Brake," Max said, for some reason whispering, "Brake." Whispered again. It was as if he was afraid to upset the balance. Julia said, also in a whisper. The girl smoothly and confidently entered the corner. Then another one, and not Shika, and on me. Max said a little indignantly, "I'm not a chick." Already through laughter, said Julia. It was incredibly funny to her. The fact that Max had been whispering to her to slow down during the whole long right turn. This moment was quite strange, dangerous, and funny at the same time. The evening came to an end. Max drove Julia to the house. He contemplated her facial features, her bare shoulders. He wanted to touch them. He hoped for a kiss, but the girl, thanking him for such an incredible adventure, said goodbye and got out of the car, leaving Max alone with his waiting. Tough nut. Why so? Puzzled the guy. The guy saw Julia as a very strong person, even though she was 5 years younger than him. Max was surprised, amazed, delighted, and at the same time aroused a great desire to really show himself in this life. The girl showed Max this world in a different way. He was very much surprised when he learned that you can be happy about simple things, such as a good night's sleep or a successful jam, fresh tea or friendly communication with the customer, or the completion of work before the deadline. Max was unfamiliar with this. After all, he never had to hurry or manage anything. The cook would always make him tea at any time. A true, sincere friendship. He never thought about that. And in order to finish things on time, but Max did not have his own personal affairs for which he could be responsible. The lad knew that the time would come and he would quietly and safely take his mother's place. Julia had become an amazing person to him. With every meeting they had, he admired her more and more. He was literally enchanted by her. So sweet, gentle, and cheerful, and so determined, responsible, and most importantly, seeing the goal ahead. It made Max think about his future life more than anything else. Yes, becoming a bank manager is an amazing job, always financially secure. But Max wanted to learn how to overcome obstacles on his own and make his own path. At home, Max thought about how he could do something nice for Julia. He wanted to impress her, to accomplish some feat. All those banal rooftop dates or car rides were not feats. They were entertainment. But the real Max was racking his brains. A spaniel entered the room. Herman brought in his mouth a fashion magazine that his mother often flipped through. "Since when are you interested in fashion?" Max jokingly asked the spaniel. In response, he received the magazine and absolutely at length and palm. "And Herman," howled the boy. He immediately pulled out a damp napkin and wiped his hand. Then his gaze fell on the fashion magazine. The guy seriously thought about it. For about 20 minutes, he sat still and looked at the cover of the magazine, which showed a happy girl in a beautiful and stylish lilac dress. The next seconds, a terrific idea hit the guy, which made his heart beat more frequently. It was now more than ever that he was sure that this was what would work, emboldened by this thought that had now grown into a real goal. Max walked out into the hall with a smile on his face. There he met his mother with Cindy. It turned out that the girl had come to visit him and give him a book that had become one of her favorites. Max displayed a grin, as his mother had taught him in cases when you don't like a person very much, but you have to be polite. "Hi," Cindy said hello. He returned the favor. "Thanks for the book. I'll be sure to read it a little later." The smile never left his lips. "I have something very important to do right now." "I have to run away," Max said and kissed his mother on the cheek. He hurried away. "He is so cute and sweet," Cindy said, definitely feeling like the one Max was dreaming of. Nancy, realizing that Cindy was not interested in her son, smiled back at her. Meanwhile, Max came to the cafe. Before coming here, he had already managed to call several girls he knew. Everyone was gathered around a round table. The girls were eagerly waiting for Max to state the reason why they had gathered. "Girls, I'm so grateful that you agreed to come here. What I need from you now is real help, your smiles, and all your talent for posing. What do you think? Fun?" asked Max, confident that they would definitely say yes. "Last month you promised to call me back, and you never did." One of them was indignant. "And I waited for you for 3 hours, and now I have to help you at your beck and call." The girl grimaced, a disgruntled look on her face. Max furrowed his brow. He hadn't realized so many girls resented him. All his attempts to get girls to star in a fashion magazine had failed. "Okay, I admit it. I'm a jerk. You can hate me." "I deserved it," said Max. The girls left him, leaving him all alone. "It's not that simple," the guy muttered to himself. However, remembering Cindy, Max jumped out of the table and rushed home. He met her on the doorstep. She was just leaving. "Cindy, what meeting?" Trying to hold his breath, Max said. "I have a tempting proposition for you," he said. Cindy looked at Nancy in surprise. There was hope in her eyes. "Can I talk to you tete-a-tete?" he asked, smiling slyly. "Of course you can," she agreed happily, her eyes bulging. She was discouraged by such a sudden change in her son's behavior. "Anyway, I have a proposition for you," Max began, telling her his idea. "So you will be on the cover of a magazine in the most fashionable dress." He finished. "I, of course, expected a little different from you, but I'd be happy to help you," she said. Max heard so much sincerity and purity in her words that he almost felt guilty about using the girl for his own purposes. When Max managed to arrange the models for the magazine, he went to Julia's house. The girl opened the door. "Oh, Max, hello. I'm sorry I can't be with you right now. I need to finish my pants," she replied. Max's eyes rounded, making them so pitiful that Julia melted. "All right, just no more than half an hour." "Okay," she said. Max nodded quickly as the guy shared an idea with the girl. Julia seriously thought about it. "It's cool, it's great. I love it. But where are we going to get the funds?" She asked a reasonable question. She wasn't used to anyone giving her such large sums of money. "I'll be responsible for all expenses." Max blurted out. "I agree." Julia answered immediately. She didn't expect such a quick answer from herself. However, it didn't scare her that Max might suddenly demand the money back. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she firmly knew that this had to end in success. And even if it didn't, the desire to start acting on it was very motivating. It would be a very interesting experience. From that day on, Julia began to actively prepare for the event. She had a lot of guests at her house. While one girl was trying on the dress and Julia was adjusting the material, the other 5 were sitting in the kitchen together with grandfather Alex drinking tea with raspberries and gingerbread, and the old man was telling the girls different stories from his life. "There was such a man in our village," Grandpa Alex said. "He had a lot of strength. What were his high shoulders like?" Grandfather spread his hands with spread fingers. "Here he goes with his horse to the forest to collect firewood." Then one of the girls interrupted him with her bare hands. She was perplexed. "Aha," continued the grandfather. "And so he loads the cart to the top and comes back with firewood. And it was necessary to go uphill." The girls listened with their mouths open. "And so the horse goes up the mountain, carrying the cart. I'm almost at the top, but I can't get it up. What should I do?" He asked a rhetorical question. "So the man takes the cart instead of the horse and pulls it himself." The girls gasped. "Aha." The grandfather Alex continued. He strains and pulls it himself and lifts the cart up the mountain. How strong was that? Finished the old man. And what kind of man? Just a gift, said one of them. The others clapped their eyes. That's how the days of future models for the magazine passed. Taking off some clothes. Conversations with Alex's grandfather and tea. Julia labored like a bee, drew up blueprints and made patterns, adjusted dresses to the figure, selected material, downloaded details. Cindy watched over the discipline of the girls. Max all this time was looking for a suitable room for shooting, made arrangements with photographers and lighting. After a month of hard work, everything was ready for the show. Julia was very excited. Max was also worried, but what worried him the most was that he had managed to organize such an event himself, to gather people, to find a room, to think about advertising, and this is already a great success. Do you look irresistible? Max said, turning to Julia. She applied her makeup with a deft movement. She drew one arrow, then another. Thank you. That's nice to hear, Julia replied, smiling at his reflection in the mirror. The music began to play rhythmically, the spotlights shining brightly on both sides of the spacious rectangular room, sat the invited guys and girls, men and women. The host, who was Max's friend, announced the start of the evening, and the first pair of girls came out in summer jumpsuits, stylish, bright, beautiful. They strutted down the red carpet, swaying their hips with confidence. The efforts of Christina's friend Julia did not go in vain. They were followed by two more couples in overalls, shorts, and other colors. The audience in the hall sat in silence. At first, they couldn't figure out how to react. The second wave pleased the audience with summer dresses with long skirts. The girls looked very elegant and feminine in these outfits. There was applause. Julia, who stood backstage in excitement, watched the reaction and the assembled audience. Then the presenter paused and played a little game with the audience. During this time, the models had time to change their clothes and makeup. The music started again. It was already more assertive. On the red carpet appeared charming girls in women's shirts. Free cut was hidden on and belt and in the legend. This form of attire perfectly emphasized the waist, and from any type of figure created everyone's favorite shape. Hourglass men avidly saw off the models, who confidently walked on the stage, looking straight ahead. Everything about them was perfect. Clothes, shoes, facial expressions, hairstyles. They attracted playful smiles, men, envious glances of women. Julia, who had remained in the shadows all this time, trembled with pleasure and covered in goosebumps from the swell of their feelings. For a job well done, aren't you cold? Asked her Max, who stealthily crept up behind her and put a hand on her shoulder. Julia flinched. The fright on her face was replaced by a smile. No, something was so tense. How can one freeze? The girl replied, continuing to watch the scene. The guests were happy, their faces shining. Cries of delight could be heard. Max took Julia's hand and placed it in his palm. He brought his and her fingertips together and felt some roughness on the surface of the skin. It is better not to touch my hand yet, Julia muttered, removing her hand. She turned her palm upward. The pads of her fingers showed barely visible white spots, labor calluses. The girl laughed. Turning, picking, holding the cloth. She pictured it with gestures. Yesterday, to make time, sat up until midnight. She spoke with a slight smile. Max noticed again her persistence and stamina. He should learn a lot from this girl. Are you incredible? Max said. I'm in awe of you, he admitted. Julia blossomed. Thank you for organizing everything. It's a lot of work, and it's incredible. She repeated, raising her eyebrows high. The two laughed. Max moved closer to Julia. His gaze lowered to her nun-like lips. An unknown force drew them together. There were only a few centimeters between them. Julia, get ready, reported Martin, who was the host. Having said that, he went to the dressing room to the girls. How quickly the time flew by, said Julia, and disappeared into the closet. Max remained standing backstage. In front of his eyes stood the girl's face, which a second ago was so close. Ladies and gentlemen, our event has come to an end, said the host. And now I present to your attention the person who, in fact, created all these beautiful outfits with her delicate hands. Julia loudly said his name. Julia felt the heat in her head and ears. She was unprepared for so much attention to her person. Come on, Julia, come on. Martin whispered, pushing the girl onto the stage. Julia walked down the red carpet. The bright lights were blinding. The photographer's flashes were confusing the landmarks. She hadn't realized walking back and forth would be so difficult. She saw the faces of people watching her intently, following her every step. Someone was pointing at her and saying something to his neighbor. The girl felt a slight dizziness. She wasn't used to so many eyes. When she returned backstage, her heart was pounding frantically and her mouth was dry. Max jumped up. He held her by the arms. "It's all right. You always can," he pronounced. You could hear the worry in his voice. Julia couldn't get a word out at that moment. She breathed and tried to calm down. And then Max felt for the first time that she needed him now more than ever. He convinced Julia to hold her against him. Everything was fine. Everything was cool. "You looked great," he whispered, swaying sideways with her. The showroom event was a great success. It shook up the city. Julia's name was on the lips of the townspeople. After such a big project, Julia closed herself in her home and did not want to go out. She felt like everyone was pointing fingers at her now. She realized that she was in no way ready for the scrutiny, attention, and to be noticed. Julia was lying on the couch in her room, with a blanket and a mug of chai and milk. After it was over, she wanted to shut herself in a hole so no one could see her. "Julia, hello my dear," whispered Christina. She entered so quietly that Julia didn't immediately notice her. Christina stretched out, getting out from under the blanket and hugging her friend. "I'll get you some tea," she said. Julia came back to the room with a tray of tea and sweets. "This is all so unfamiliar," Julia said, taking a piece of chocolate. "Do you need to get used to it?" answered Christina. "Or if you think it's a big deal." What a big event it was. Then imagine someone else doing even bigger and much, much more often. "So you're just one performer in a huge theater." The friend smiled. "Well, as for me, I'm thrilled. I enjoyed everything so much that I want to participate in it some more." Christina looked up and smiled broadly, imagining the next show. "And that handsome guy, named Max, by the way, are you two together?" Christina's eyes gleamed with cunning. Then she took a small cube of brownie, cut it into pieces, and sent it into her mouth. Julia was slow to answer. "I don't know, just socializing for now," she replied thoughtfully. She had always been cautious in her relationships with people, and especially with guys. She had never felt a great need to have a boyfriend. She had always had other interests in her life that she also enjoyed. After a day, Julia was back into her usual rhythm. It seemed as if the clothing show had been a whole month instead of 3 days ago. So much was it knocked out of the usual rhythm of life. The girl busied herself with sewing. Today, they brought her material for curtains. Julia pressed the pedal, and the machine sewed a straight stitch. And it calmed her down. Max had called once. But Julia did not worry because she did not think about him. There was a knock at the door. "I will open the door," Julia said and went to the door. Max stood on the threshold. He looked a little mysterious. "What's the intrigue?" asked Julia. Smiling, she was happy to see Max. The guy realized that he was seriously interested in her and decided to take advantage of it. "Uncovering the intrigue is worth 2 kisses, he mumbled, hiding his hands behind his back. Julia stood silent, not knowing what to say. "Okay, just one little kiss," Max spoke. Julia leaned her palm to her lips and sent the guy an air kiss. Max marveled, "You're a sly one." He objected. "That's not fair. You didn't specify what kind of kiss." Julia laughed. Max handed her the magazine on the cover. She recognized one of the girls from the fashion show. And at the top was a large inscription. "The sun shone on our city." The girl flipped through all the pages. The pictures were amazing. It was like she didn't make those clothes at all. It was unbelievable. "It's incredible," Julia exclaimed. Then she pounced on Max and threw him right into her lips. She jumped and cheered like a child who had gotten an unexpected surprise. "You're a genius, you're a wizard. How did you do that, class?" The girl couldn't believe her eyes. "I just made a deal with the right people," pronounced Max, satisfied that he managed to do something worthy for the girl with whom he clearly fell in love. "Do you have a talent?" Julia turned to him. "You have to know how to negotiate with people," she remarked, looking into Max's eyes. At that moment, he felt himself growing stronger in his own eyes and in the eyes of the person who was important to him. "Julia, be my girlfriend," Max said unexpectedly. "Your girlfriend," repeated Julia. "What does that mean, your girlfriend?" "I'm not a thing." She asked a question. Had she confused him again? No, of course not. Max was confused. "I meant that I'd like to ask you to go out with me. I would like to take care of you and help you." Max didn't have time to finish. Julia put her palm to his lips. "You can't know that." She spoke in advance and touched her warm lips to his. Max was over the moon. Max and Julia continued to socialize as they had free days before. They talked a lot, discussed different topics, went for car rides, swam at the river until September. Max, after a successful attempt to publish his first magazine, decided to continue this endeavor. At the same time, he created a YouTube channel where he published interviews with different interesting people of the city. It was Julia who helped him to discover in himself a unique ability to build relationships with people. And Max loved it. He felt it was his strength. He felt he could build on it to take the next steps. "Mom, are we going to have company tonight?" Max announced. "And who is it?" Nancy inquired, trying on earrings to match her dress. "She got home early from work today and was going to get a massage. You look very pretty." Max complimented her. "Thank you, my dear," the mother replied. She stroked her son's cheek. "6 will be home." Max said goodbye to his mother. The cook had prepared marvelous food and drinks. Dessert was eagerly awaited. Nancy and William sat at the round table, waiting for their son's arrival. Husband and wife were a little bored. William was spoiling the soloist by trying to put it on a fork. Wife stopped him. The husband obediently put the fork down. But lo and behold, the tall doors swung open, and Max and Julia entered the living room. Max's father, William, was pleasantly surprised to see such a pretty creature beside his son. Nancy, on the other hand, raised her chin high and managed to cast a few glances at the girl from top to bottom. Max's mother was immediately struck by the girl's fullness. Julia was in a closed dress with a belt, but it still gave away her slight excess weight. "Mom, Dad, meet Julia, my girlfriend," Max said excitedly. Nancy rounded her eyes and almost opened her mouth, but hid it behind a wide smile. Julia said hello in the same way. "Ah, how lovely," lied her mother, discreetly looking at the full thighs, her son's chosen one. "Our son is such a joker," said Nancy. Julia, without giving any meaning to her phrase, walked with Max to the table. The boy helped her to sit down. William caught his son's gaze. He was genuinely pleased with his choice. "Julia, you probably can't have fat. You're on a diet," the mother said wryly, sending a piece of salted fish into her mouth. "I have to tell you," Julia replied, "that I don't follow any diets, and moreover, I consider my figure to be unique," Julia replied, which she was happy with. Nancy did not forget to stretch her lips in a smile. "Well, son, will you tell me how you met the charming Julia?" asked the father. Nancy glanced at him, hiding her indignation. Max remembered their first meeting. Julia looked at him with a request in her eyes not to tell him about the cafe. "Can I say that our paths have coincidentally crossed?" Max began. "I came to pick up an order already placed and to sew myself a shirt," he replied. "And who bothered to tell you that I could do the same?" "More polite?" asked Nancy and looked at the girl with some contempt. "Your sister, Mom, Aunt Wendy?" Max answered. Nancy choked. To hide her embarrassment, she took a glass of juice. By the way, Julia had her first fashion show this summer, with clothes sewn by herself from her own patterns. Max reported. "Really? Really?" exclaimed the father. "Congratulations. So you've been doing this for a long time. Maybe you graduated from a school?" Father asked. "Oh no, I am self-taught," Julia answered with ease. "A couple of years ago, a neighbor gave me an old machine in the closet. Found materials from a long time ago, and everything came together," said the girl, taking a bite of an orange caviar sandwich and sticking firmly above her upper lip. At this point, Nancy looked at Julia. Nancy, who herself was very much into new outfits and did not miss fashion trends, could not get it into her head how a simple girl managed to organize this project. "Julia, did you have money or savings to finance the event?" she asked, looking directly into the girl's eyes. "Was it your son's idea?" Julia replied. "He took care of all the expenses," she replied. Nancy was discouraged. Her son had taken money from the family budget. For some obscure girl. Even so. Nancy stretched out, looking at William. Max pressed the right corner of his lip. He had forgotten to warn Julia not to talk about it. His mother was very jealous of money. She counted her expenses daily, while always forgiving herself for big spends on clothes and furnishings. "Well, son, I'm glad you put your money in the right direction for once." William laughed. "Thanks, Dad." Max shook his head. He knew he had a habit of wasting his father's money on nonsense. "Julia has her own magazine," Max said. "But I'm not involved in that business at all," the guest objected. "The process of creating the magazine is completely organized by you," Julia said. "What?" the father asked, not believing his ears. "My son creates something himself. It's a joke." He laughed again. Nancy kept the mask of kindness, of desirability. In reality, she was being gnawed on from the inside by greed, by jealousy. She had time to notice that this girl really meant something to him. It was as if she was starting to feel herself slowly but surely being sidelined right now. Dinner came to an end. Julia thanked Max's family for their hospitality and a great dinner. "Yes, thank you, Julia. But I would still recommend that you eat smaller portions." "Yes," Nancy said. "I will certainly think about your suggestion," Julia replied. She felt an incipient desire to answer Max's mother so that she would not have any more thoughts about it. Max drove Julia home. "In front of your family, I look like a wire from the village." The girl laughed. "My mom, she's always jealous of me," Max said. "I think you get along with her," he said. After which they said goodbye. "Son dear," his mother turned to him when he got home. "You don't mean to say that you are really going to tie your life to this one, do you?" She was matching words with this girl. Nancy overpowered herself not to say the nasty thing. "That's exactly what I wanted to tell you and your father. And I think I've made that clear," Max replied. "You're upsetting me," the mother said in a voice ready to let a tear fall. "Mom, she's a good girl, determined," said Max, determined. The mother boiled over into a shouting match. "She comes from a poor family. What kind of determination is that supposed to mean? Such people have a bad reputation." She said in a steely voice, "She would tarnish our family." "Think what father will say," she asked in anger. "I spoke to my father. He liked it," Max said. "He told you so because he knows your nature, which very quickly loses interest in everything around you. He thinks you're not playing and will calm down. But I can see that," the mother said, raising her fingers in a single point. "You must stop all communication with her," Nancy said, changing to a calm tone. "We can't have this kind of thing in the newspapers. We are responsible for our reputation and position in society." "Go," she said when she had finished speaking. Max left his mother's room. Following him, the spaniel took over. He sensed that his mate was upset about something. Max didn't argue with his mother. He knew it was useless. This beautiful, rich woman, who is endowed with a certain power, is actually full of fears that torment her. But Max didn't know how he could change her point of view. As winter began, things slowed down and calmed down a bit. And when it fully came into its own, it forced the residents to wait out the hard frosts by the fireplace and with a warm blanket. Well, while they were basking under the soft stoves, Julia embodied new ideas of warm winter skirts, bright and interesting colors. She was happy when the customer was happy. Simultaneously, every 2 months under Max's guidance, a magazine with new models of both women's and men's clothing was published. To be in this subject, Max took considerable pleasure. But with the arrival of spring, life revitalized anew. The sun shone more. The earth walked more strongly. The energy of love and the desire to live began to move in people. For almost a year now, Max and Julia have stayed close to each other. Unable to wait any longer, Max takes decisive steps. "Max, hello, come in, said Alexa's grandfather, opening the door for him. "How do you say hello?" asked Max, shaking his hand. "Thank you to say hello in front of us," replied Grandpa Alex. All three of them gathered around the table. Julia had prepared a delicious dinner. Despite her shyness and means, Julia always cooked deliciously. When everyone was about to start eating, Max suddenly got up from the table. "I have a little digression from lunch," he said, leaving the table. Julia watched with interest to see what would happen next. Max got down on one knee and suddenly held out a wedding ring with the words, "Julia, I offer you to be my wife," he said. He was so real in that moment. Julia glanced at her grandfather. He sat silent, with his spoon in his hand. "This is all so unexpected," she said. "Are you sure about this?" Julia asked. "I know you're changing my life around you. I want to make myself better," he said quietly. "I'm ready to learn to take responsibility for my future family," Max said. His words gave Julia an inner thrill. "I wanted to listen to them and listen to them." "I agree," the girl replied. A gold ring was put on her ring finger, forced Julia to cover the samurai. It looked marvelous. The wedding was scheduled in a month. Max, coming home, told his mother and father this happy news. He didn't care what they thought. He knew that this girl loved him, and that he was ready to do many things for her sake that had never happened to him before. From what she heard, Nancy was silent for a moment and then still found something to say. Max, keeping herself in control, began to speak his mother. "Please tell me it's not true? Are you just trying to mess with your beloved mother?" she said. William came up behind her and put his arm around her shoulders. She paid no attention. Nancy put her hand on the bridge of her nose. "Darling, say something." She turned to her husband. William shrugged. "I trust my son's choice. What can I say?" "I can't make his heart fall out of love with this girl," he muttered. "Did she blind you?" Nancy exclaimed, walking over to the open window. "You'll realize that all she wants from you is money. She has already forced you to pay for her wants in the form of ridiculous outfits and ridiculous fashion shows," she said. Her face turned red. The bad blood played out in the body of a mother who thought that since she gave life to a child, she decides who the child should be with. "Don't say that," Max replied. "I took the responsibility myself," he said firmly. "You took the responsibility," Nancy grinned at him. "Honey, stop it. You're making it worse." William tried to talk some sense into her. "You're not getting married, are you?" Nancy said in a cold tone. 2 blue shards of ice pierced through her son, after which Nancy walked out of the living room. The son tried to console his father. "Don't worry, she'll get over it. That's women," he said, and went to follow his wife. From that day onwards, Nancy's life changed abruptly. Peace left her head and heart. From now on, she lived with the desire to separate the couple and bring her own son back to her. Nancy could not allow the one she had raised, the one she had invested in, all of a mother's love taken for herself, some shepherdess country girl collective farmer. The woman paced from side to side, occasionally looking out the window. She was waiting for Max Nancy to arrive. The maid's voice came out. "To make you soothing tea was offered by a woman in her early 50s. "Ah, Molly," the mother said wistfully. "I'm not at peace with myself. How can I talk some sense into my son?" she asked as she plumped down on the sofa. Her long summer dress spread softly on the seat. "I'm afraid I can't help you here. Is your husband right?" she added. "Bring me some hot tea," said Nancy in a voice filled with tenderness. She had always liked Molly. She was the only woman in her neighborhood from a poor family to whom she could confide all her secrets. As strange as that might sound, sometimes in talking to her, she felt like a little girl surrounded by her mother's love. Nancy herself, along with her sister Rosa, had grown up in a God-forsaken village. Having come to the city to study, they were desperate to escape poverty. They worked hard, giving all their time to their studies and work. Finally, their labors were rewarded. Nancy and Wendy graduated from a top banking school. However, Wendy soon married well and Nancy took a job at the bank. She started at the bottom of the ladder, but thanks to her skills and her acquaintance with William, who at that time was already a young and promising lawyer, she quickly worked her way up to the head of the bank. Having become a successful and wealthy woman, which is very rare for someone like her, Nancy could not free herself from the fear that it could all end in an instant. She had long ago had a big, beautiful house, a car with a private driver, servants, expensive things, delicious food, a favorite son, and a loving husband. But the feeling that she did not deserve it did not leave her. And now Julia, who appeared so unexpectedly, became a direct threat to her personal happiness. After all, this girl was a reminder of her past life, which she tried to forget, from which she wanted to get out of. Nancy, the maid's back. Here's your tea, freshly made. She spoke affectionately, and Natalia's heart grew warm. Max came home for a moment to tell you that he had some business to attend to. He had to go, Molly said. I understand, you can go, the woman said in a low voice. Nancy sat with her fingers crossed. She folded them and then folded them again and spread them again. Nancy pondered further plans. The wedding must not take place. The wedding was a week away. Nancy put on her best pantsuit with an elegant cutout on the back, a wide-brimmed hat and glasses, completed her expressive look. Giving the driver the address, she set off to meet her. Welcome to our private establishment, the pleasant girl at the entrance to the restaurant for VIP guests said. Nancy smiled at the corner of her lips and went to the table she had reserved. There was someone waiting for her. It was a man of about 47 years of age. He looked very young. The lilac shirt gave him a fresh look. Nancy took off her glasses and hat. Hello, dear. The man spoke and kissed her hand. I am very glad to see you. You are still beautiful and young. He complimented her. Anthony, I am very glad that you agreed to meet, Nancy said. She looked at his smooth, shaven face, at the swarthy skin, and blue eyes shining with fire. I really need your help. The case is not too serious. It's personal, she said. My love, anything for you, he said, raised a glass of wine to his lips. We need to kidnap one person for a while. It's a girl, said Nancy. Wow, the man marveled. How dare she cross my queen? Anthony went on with his beautiful words. He was an old friend of Nancy's. They had once been very close in their distant youth, but Nancy had opted for William, a successful and promising husband for the future. Not to me, but to my son, she replied. To charm him requires no end of money. Nancy lied. She didn't think Anthony should know the whole truth. We just need to get her out of here so she can't find her way back, she asked as she bought a small red drink. Yeah, easy. When do we need to pick her up? Asked Anthony. I'm sorry that woman ever left him. Nancy replied, fixing a lock of hair. I'll give you the address later so you can do it from the rank, she said. And then she added, let's make sure that everything is neat and quiet. Whatever you say, replied Anthony. Nancy put on her glasses and hat and walked out of the establishment. Anthony reached over and picked up Nancy's glass, which had her lipstick imprints on it. He ran his thumb over the trail. He regretted not being able to be her husband. Nancy returned home, full of energy. She was in a good mood. A smile shone on her face. She was glad that she would be able to keep her family out of misfortune. Max said cheerfully when he returned home after his many errands. With Julia's arrival, his life had taken on a new meaning. It was as if new doors had opened. He began to see things he could not see before. Son, my darling, come to me, Nancy said. I want you to know that I love you, she said, wanting to make him feel sorry for her. I love you too, Moms, Max replied. After kissing her on the cheek, did your father give you this? She said, holding out the envelope to him. What is it that you don't understand, Max? I don't know what he wanted to tell you, Nancy answered. I take off the jewelry and put it on the table. Max went back to his room. Opening the letter, he read a few lines. Dear son, I am very sorry for the decision I have made, but I cannot go against the will of my beloved woman. I have to inform you that if you do not stop your relationship with Julia, I will have to close your bank account and also disinherit you. And follow your heart." Max was shocked. He hadn't expected such a turn on his forehead. Sweat was beating up on him, for the wedding was a week away. The restaurant had been booked. The guests had been invited. Everything had been prepared and was waiting for payment in the next few days. Max crumpled the letter and, taking his jacket, quickly left the house. Nancy went to the window. Max opened the door of his car, raised his head as gaze met his mother's eyes. Nancy experienced a thrill of excitement. Never before had she been in such a confrontation with her son. Remembering the promised address, she picked up the phone and dialed her sister. "Hello, hi, listen, I wanted to make a dress for myself too. Could you give me the number of that atelier where you've been making mistakes lately? She's got that angelic voice. Why not? Sure, I'll send it right over. You'll be thrilled. The girl is very nice, sews professionally," said Wendy. Nancy kindly nodded to her sister. When the address was received, she immediately forwarded it to Anthony. However, instead of the usual "okay," she received a message asking, "Will I see you soon?" Nancy furrowed her brow. "What?" she asked in a full voice. Why the hell was she outraged? At the sounds, Molly walked into the room. "What's wrong?" "Everything's fine," she asked worriedly. "It's just the phone's on the fritz. And I need to make an emergency call," Nancy said wrongly. "What are you talking about?" "I'll pay you back." Nancy sent the next message and immediately received a reply. "I don't need the money." "You know that." "God, how awful." Nancy whispered and wrote to him. "When the deed is done, I'm yours." Her heart was pounding frantically. "Waiting for you tomorrow at the same place." Nancy stared at the messages with her mouth open. She was in a stupor. Then she automatically called Anthony. His phone was already off. "Shit," exclaimed Nancy, face in incomprehension. Meanwhile, Max went to the bank. The bank's app on his phone displayed the amount, but the guy couldn't withdraw it. Asking the female employee for help, he waited for a response. "Sorry, but unfortunately your account is blocked," the girl replied. Max thanked her and went to his car. However, what was his surprise when she was not there? Max dialed his father's number. The receiver said, "I'm in a meeting in another city. Leave a message." Dad really always put the answering machine on when he left on a business trip, not knowing what to do. Max caught a cab and drove to Julia's house. The door was opened by Grandpa Alex. "Max, hello, come in." As always, he was smothered and kind. "Are you excited about something?" asked Grandpa Alex. Immediately recognized the concern on Max's face. Julia appeared in the hallway. "What happened?" she asked, looking at the future groom, on whose face white spots appeared. "There were unforeseen circumstances." Max began to speak. "The thing is that my father blocked my bank account and took my car." He said, "What does that mean?" Julia didn't understand. "It means that we won't be able to pay for the party and the restaurant. We'll have to cancel everything and just sign for now." Max finished. "I borrowed some money from a friend. It's enough for the first time, and then I'll get a job," he added. After the letter from his father, he decided not to return home. His grandfather kicked him out. "Your parents cut you off pretty good." Then he sat down at the table. Julia suggested that Max also go into the kitchen. "Yes, it's hard when you go against your parents' will," he said, and moved the mug of tea that Julia had just poured into a cup. The aroma of fresh, roasted tea was soothing, even embarrassing. "Now you can look me in the eye," said Max. "What's there to be ashamed of? You're already an independent guy. It's time to provide for yourself and your future wife." "If you call me to the registry office," said Alexa's grandfather. "I agree," replied Max, looking at the future bride. "I'm more worried about how you will then communicate with your parents." "It will be hard on the soul," said Julia. "Bread and tea. God help you," replied the grandfather to his granddaughter and her fiancé. After the conversation, Max came to his friend Nikita. For some time they agreed that he would live with him. That's what they did. In the meantime, Nancy was wondering what to do. All her life she had been faithful to her husband. There had never been a single time that thoughts of infidelity had crept into her mind. But now, with her peaceful life and the happiness of her beloved son at stake, she was ready to go to great lengths. There was no time to delay further. At midnight, Nancy could not sleep. Bad thoughts visited her head. Finally, sleep seized her in its embrace. She dreamed that she was standing in a restaurant wearing a beautiful long blue dress. In her hand, she held a glass of red wine. Its Serbian flavor was pleasant. Then a swarthy man with blue eyes appeared. He approached Vanessa almost closely. It was Anthony. He took the glass from her hands and laced it to the bottom, then ran his wet tongue along her slender neck. Nancy felt unprecedented pleasure. She made no attempt to stop Anthony. On the contrary, she craved love. Gradually, she gave herself to him without abandon. When Anthony had completely possessed her, she heard a familiar voice. "Nancy," the voice asked her. "What are you doing?" It was her husband. Nancy stopped, and Anthony kept on and on caressing her. The woman tried to pull away, but his hands held her with an iron grip. Then Nancy saw a multitude of curious eyes looking at her. Every minute it became harder and harder to breathe. And finally, Nancy cried out. I woke up in a cold sweat. The clock read 5 p.m. Nancy was taking a bath. A lush bubble covered her still young body. The woman stood up and covered herself with a towel. She then walked over to the closet, reviewing her outfits. Taking the first silver dress she could find, she placed it on the bed. Natural makeup, clear and straight arrows, bright red lipstick. Nancy had her hair styled into a perfect bob. Calling a cab, she left for the meeting place. The pleasant music was a joy to listen to. A polite hostess escorted the woman to the proper private room for VIP guests. Here, any topic could be discussed without eavesdropping. It's good to see you again. And my love, said Anthony, and as he always did. He kissed Vanessa's hand. Let's get out of here quickly. Please, said Nancy. She was a little nervous. You can't rush these things, Anthony said, loosening the tie on his light pink shirt. He always dressed tastefully, which had attracted Nancy in his day. You're making me take a lot of risks, Nancy said, trying to let him know her excitement. Do you too? Anthony replied and smiled, placing his large palm over her hand. How about a drink? He suggested, opening the menu. Nancy didn't know what to say. She had no intention of spending the evening with him. However, she had unknowingly entered into a dangerous game. The waiter brought glasses, wine, and a cheese and meat platter. You still make me feel things. Can you imagine, Anthony said, looking at Nancy's high cheekbones and sensual lips. Why didn't you ever marry that girl? Remember, she asked him, trying to change the subject to a more worldly one. I kept hoping that your icy heart would melt, and you would come back to me, he said as he downed his wine and put a slice of cheese in his mouth. See, I'm still living that hope, he said unashamedly, examining the delicate skin of her cleavage. Nancy felt uncomfortable. She wanted to cover herself with a blanket when the torture in the restaurant was over, though. The couple headed for the exit. Anthony had taken care of the car in advance and where they would go. The man brought Nancy to his luxurious country home. It was made of wood and stone. Lamps burned everywhere, illuminating the green garden and the beautiful grounds in the street in front of the house. Could you live here? Anthony said, showing the beauty of his house with his hands. Shall we go swimming? He asked, looking at the pool. Nancy began to hope that perhaps Anthony had changed his mind about his proposal. The man unbuttoned his shirt and threw off his pants, then plunged into the water. For a moment, the thought of running crept into Nancy's head, but she remembered they had a deal. The woman took off her dress and slowly entered the water. Good girl, pronounced Anthony under the words closer. Relax, let's just enjoy ourselves. When was the last time you were easy and direct? Nancy did not see fit to answer. She floated on her back, all the while following Anthony's movements. Dial it up, said Anthony. I'll see you underwater. He dove in and very quickly began to approach Vanessa. The woman swam away from him. But Anthony caught up with her in 1 second and lifted her in his arms. Nancy gasped in surprise. I like you like this, he said more and snuggled against her body, running his hand through her hair. He unraveled it and the white curls fell to her shoulders. I remember you like this, Anthony said and beat a passionate kiss to her lips. Nancy realized she could not escape. The next early morning, Nancy returned home. She prayed that no one was home. Once inside, she walked quickly to the bathroom of her room. The locked door and the silence gave her a sense of calm. She turned on the warm shower. Diving into it, the slinky water slid over her body. She tried to get away from the memories that vivid images were popping up in her head. Anthony's house was really nice and tastefully done. As much as he himself, however, her lips still remembered his kiss from the body touch of his hands. She had to admit that she was satisfied. 2 days before Max and Julia's wedding, Alex's grandfather headed into town on business. When he had done what he needed to do, he didn't go to his house, but went to the address where Max lived. The door was opened to him by the service. She led him into the house. In the living room were present, oddly enough, all the members of the family, including William himself, Nancy, and Max. None of them had expected the old man to come. Alex's grandfather thought that Max had come to negotiate with his parents, but he had already made a decision, putting a wad of money on the table. He pronounced, "Here is the amount that is needed for the wedding. Max pays what is needed and that's it." "Pure and bright love is a gift," said Alex's grandfather. William was shocked by his action. And Alex continued, "I see, and you probably do too, that our children love each other sincerely. So let's not take the sin of destroying their love," finished the old man, then turned around and headed for the door. "Grandfather Alex, wait," and shouted as Max. "Don't you know? Julia has been kidnapped," he blurted out. Grandpa Alex's face clouded over. He furrowed his brow, however. He immediately realized whose hands it was. He walked over to the table and looked at Nancy. She lowered her eyes, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. But the old man did not avert his own. What dark eyes! "Well, Nancy, do you feel good?" asked Alex's grandfather. "A mother gives life to a child, and she is also able to take it away," said Grandpa Alex. "I don't know what you are talking about," replied the woman, turning sideways to him. "You hide your eyes." Shame on you, stretched out the grandfather. "Well, God is your judge," said he, turned around and left. All three of them remained in complete silence. Nancy continued to stare at the table. After the old man's words, she was afraid to meet her husband's eyes. "Mom, do you know something?" Max asked. William was looking at her too. She asked me, shifting her gaze from one to the other. "No more than you do." "I think that old man is crazy," she said. And then, citing the headache, she went to her room. "Dad, don't you think it's strange for a bride to disappear just before the wedding?" Max asked the question strange, not strange. "The man should be searched for," William said. Meanwhile, Nancy locked herself in the bathroom. With trembling fingers, she dialed Anthony's number. "Anthony, where is the girl?" she asked, expecting him to answer immediately. "In a safe place, like you asked. I need you to keep her for a week, a month. Or better, a year. I'll pay," she said with all her might, wishing it wouldn't be revealed. "The greatest reward for me is you. And you know it," said the voice in the tube. Nancy pressed the corners of his lips together. "You're not going to blackmail me?" she asked cautiously. "Why would I? I'll just always be waiting for you to come back. Unless, of course, it's important to you." "Sorry, I have to go to Julia," he said and hung up. Nancy looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection was gray and somber. Her eyes glistened with tears. Turning on the water, she tried to calm herself down. Nancy shuddered. There was a knock on the bathroom door from her husband. "Honey, you're here." William waited for an answer, teddying himself up. The woman appeared in the room. "Everything is all right?" William inquired. "How can I put it?" "I'm upset," she said. "And why is that?" questioned William. "Isn't this what you wanted?" he added. Although William knew nothing about the girl's abduction, Nancy tensed. "What do you mean?" she asked. William moved closer to her and pulled her against him. Nancy couldn't look him straight in the eye. She felt as if William would find out immediately. "She's pushing me away," William asked, seeing that his wife was avoiding his gaze. "You haven't been yourself since this morning," he said. "I'm just wondering if we did the right thing. But it's better this way. I'm sure, said Nancy, turning her head to the right. What's that? Asked William. Where's that spot with the little red dots? On your neck, said Nancy's husband. Nancy broke into a cold sweat. She covered it with her hand. You know, I went in for a massage, and there was this new guy. He gave me a bruise. Nancy tried to get out of it. The new guy, so William repeated. Nancy prayed to herself that her husband would believe her. Then William lifted her chin and looked her straight in the eye. Nancy could hardly stand the look in his eyes. She was afraid William would read everything in her eyes. A moment more and his lips pressed tightly against hers. I have to go away for a couple days. I can't stay. Unfortunately, William said. Keep me in the loop. Her husband finished and, leaving his jacket, left the room. Nancy followed him through the window. At some point, William looked up and Nancy flinched. She didn't want him to see her watching him through the window as William's car pulled out of the driveway. Nancy exhaled with relief. She walked over to the bed and flopped onto her back. Inside herself, she felt a sense of uneasiness from within. Meanwhile, Alexa's grandfather came to the police station. He had reported his granddaughter missing. A young uniformed policeman lazily walked to his desk and invited the grandfather to sit in a chair. Tell me if it's missing today, he asked, picking up a ballpoint pen. He played it between his fingers. Yes, all of a sudden it disappeared. The thing is, she wasn't going anywhere. She and her fiancé are getting married in 2 days, Grandpa Alex said, keeping an eye on the policeman. But these are brides. Girls are all worried before the wedding, pronounced the young police officer. Wait, she'll be back. Maybe she went to a girlfriend or something. He said, so Grandpa's lazy. Why don't you go home? The policeman concluded. Afterwards, he held out a phone number and said that if the girl didn't return in 3 days, they would organize a search. 3 days and 3 days can do anything to a man, the old man muttered. But what else was there for him to do? Grandfather Alex stood up and left the office. On his return home, he met his friend Julia with Christina. The girl in dress was waiting for him at the gate. Where did our Julia go? She asked, fending off you and the flies. Christina couldn't get through to her since morning. Is our Julia missing? Answered the grandfather. How did she disappear? I don't understand you, Grandpa Alex. Christina said. What do you mean missing? They had a fight with Max, she asked. That's the thing, everything is fine between them. I went to the city today, then to Max's parents, and he was there too. Max told me that Julia was missing. Her cell phone was off. I stood around, then I went to the police, and I just got home. And Julia was still gone, Grandpa said. I opened the lock with the key. What do we do now? Christina sits down on the chair. She put her hand to her lips, looking from object to object, as if she wanted to find a clue among them. Wait, what to do? Maybe she really will come on her own, Alex said. Nancy. I was lying on the bed with my arms out to the sides. In a matter of days, she had turned her life upside down, remembering Anthony's tender kiss. She ran the pads of her fingers over her lips. There was a knock on the door of the room. The woman flinched. Max appeared in the doorway. Ah, son, it's you, she said, bringing herself back to normal. Mom, I wanted to ask you a question, Max said, taking a couple of steps toward her. Go ahead. I'm listening, Nancy replied, moving over to the couch. Nancy turned to Max so that he wouldn't see the stain that was left by the encounter with Anthony. Mom, tell me the truth. You didn't say anything like that to Julia. What would make her disappear? Asked Max, approaching her desk where she usually did her makeup. No, son, no. Why would I do that with a look of incomprehension on my face? Answered Nancy. Yes, I admit that your father was cruel to you, depriving you of your money. But it's all for your own good. You'll thank me later, she said. Max had his back to her. He was looking at the various cosmetic items on the table. Then his gaze fell on a piece of paper of exactly the same texture on which the letter from his father had been written. He gently pushed the sheet toward him, and another sheet was revealed, on which something was written in his mother's hand. At this time, Nancy was massaging her whiskey. She wanted her son to see her suffer. I hear you, Mom, I'm sorry. Max walked over to her. I love you, he pronounced, and then hurriedly removed himself from her room. Max went into his own and quickly unfolded the written sheet. On it, in Nancy's handwriting, was written everything he had read in the letter from his father. He knew now that his mother had thought it all out, and that she was just telling his father. The door shrieked open. Max crumpled the sheet sharply and turned around. It was a spaniel. With a wistful look, it came toward him and nuzzled against his leg. Max reached down and rubbed his neck. Max then packed up some of his things and left the house, heading to a friend's house where he was staying for the first time. Living at Julia's house was a little wrong for him. Yes, and there wasn't much room, since she takes customers at home without saying anything to her mother. Max got into a cab and drove away from the backyard of the house. Nancy went downstairs, calling for her son. Realizing she was home alone, she called Anthony again. The phone was still unavailable. Maybe it was for the best, though, she said to herself. What if something happened to the girl? A bright thought flashed through her mind. It's not my concern anymore, she reassured herself. Would you like to relax a little? The man asked, pouring himself some hot drinks. Anthony approached the girl and offered her a drink. She refused. What's your name? Julia? He asked after he had soaked his throat with a cold drink. The girl nodded her head. I don't understand your behavior. The girl said, looking around. It was obvious that the interior was chosen by professionals. I would not like to stay with you for a long time, said Julia. Let's hurry up. I'll take the measurements for your curtains. I'll calculate how much material I need, and then I'll go home. Okay, take the measurements. Anthony replied casually. Leaving the girl alone, he went upstairs and went about his business. Julia got to work. She hoped that since Anthony had recommended her to Nancy, maybe she had changed her attitude towards her. She had no idea that she was here for something else. All done, Julia pronounced, when she finally changed everything. No one was helping her with that. Sketch out a few designs for the curtains. She waited in the living room for Anthony to return. When no one answered her, she called out to the owner of the house once more. Silence alarmed the girl. She felt a little uneasy in such a large house. Anthony's house was like the dwelling of a dragon. Stone replaced wood and wood replaced stone. The sunlight barely filtered through the closed blinds. Looking for the owner of the house, the girl went upstairs. The different pieces of furnishings enticed Julia. It was as if she had entered another world that beckoned her with its uniqueness. The girl's attention was attracted by a statuette made of pure wood. It was a dragon, every scale of Inca. Each lesson was crafted with precision. Most eerie of all were the dragon's orange eyes. Standing just above her height, he looked confident, straight ahead, and without a drop of pity. The girl felt like touching him. She reached out to touch one of his sharp teeth. They looked just like the real thing. Careful, you can be amazed, rang out behind her back. Julia gasped. You finally showed up? Julia answered, turning to the dragon again. Whose job is this? She asked. I don't remember, it's some kind of craftsman. Anthony waved it away. Julia looked at him in disbelief. The measurements are ready, Julia said, holding out a notebook of sketches to him. You're not bad at sketching, she said. No one has ever drawn my dwelling so precisely on one sheet of paper with a pencil. Julia thanked him and smiled. I'll order a cab. Will you give me the address? Julia insisted, realizing that their conversation was on the edge of business and personal. As she was about to pick up her phone to dial the number, she realized it had been left in her purse in the lobby. Why a cab? Do you need me to drive you? Pronounced Anthony, but only a little later. I'd like to talk to you a little longer. Let's use the first name. Julia was confused. I would love to talk to you, but I have a wedding in 2 days. So I'd like to get home as soon as possible, Julia said. And it was true. I know. Nancy told me, said Anthony, and I put my hand against the wall so that Julia was sandwiched between the dragon and the man. Are you and Nancy lovers? She asked him, wanting to be discouraged by the question. But the man did not give in and answered calmly. Perhaps it seemed that Anthony liked to stuff himself with such games, not wanting any more part of it. Julia, with a sharp movement, kicked Anthony between the legs, then pushed him away. She rushed down the stairs toward the exit. But when she pushed open the front door, it was locked. She started to turn the knob to unlock it, but it wouldn't budge. Apparently, it was locked with a key that was nowhere to be found. Julia rushed to the nearest nightstand to find the key, but there was nothing there. Anthony appeared on the second floor. Endure the pain. He was already on his way downstairs, but he was in no hurry at all. On the contrary, he enjoyed watching the girl desperately trying to find the key. When the man was already a few steps away and the key was still missing, Julia rushed into the interior of the house. She didn't know where she could hide, but ran into the nearest room. She locked herself from the inside. Her heart was pounding frantically and her temples jostling. She was riddled with worry. A knock on the door made her flinch. Anthony's voice was heard. "Julia, I'm sorry, it was a bad joke," he muttered. "I demand my belongings and my cell phone with the address of your house." The girl said in a serious tone, "Julia, understand, I can't do that. I promised one person that you would be here for a while," answered Anthony. He thought that a girl from the suburbs could be quickly lured to his side. "What do you mean here? Get my phone here immediately. Otherwise, I'll have to make a very big mess in your house," said Julia. And she wasn't kidding about the mess. "The cleaning lady comes regularly to clean the house, so you don't have to worry, but I can't let you out." "I keep my promise," said Anthony. There was silence for a while. And then Julia heard footsteps. And a moment later, the sound of a door slamming shut. The girl realized he was gone. She pulled back the deadbolt, but the door was now locked from the outside. "Oh no," Julia said. What was this nonsense? She couldn't understand why she was being kept here. And then it hit her. That's what Anthony had said. Nancy had told him to bring her here in order to keep Max and her from signing off. The thought made her head spin after sitting in silence for an hour. Julia wanted to go to the bathroom. Literally, need made her look around the room. It was spacious and bright, even though the windows were also covered with blinds. The room had a large and soft sofa, a couple of armchairs, and a wide table. And then my gaze fell on another door. Behind it was a bathroom with a shower and a toilet. Julia went back into the room and continued her explorations. She went to the window. It was unlocked. The girl opened it freely. At that moment, it seemed to her that all her problems were solved. However, when she opened the window, she was greatly surprised to find that it was at least 5 meters to the ground. What kind of paradox is this? She thought. But then she remembered that she had run down a small staircase and had come to a door that led to this room. Looking around the cabinets that were here, she found nothing of interest to her. This room resembled a meeting room or a study for privacy. There was nothing superfluous here. Tired of wandering aimlessly, Julia plumped down on the sofa. The hot day tired the girl, and soon she fell asleep. Meanwhile, Nancy was hurrying to meet Anthony. She wanted to pay him a decent amount of money so that he would stop torturing her and not make any more appointments. Anthony himself had called her, and the woman had rushed to take advantage of it. The driver was taking her to her car. Nancy was nervous. She was in a hurry. She wanted to get away quickly. Suddenly, the car stopped. "What's wrong? Why aren't we going?" She asked the driver, but he didn't hear her because he had already gone outside. A moment later, the passenger door opened, and the driver told her they had arrived. Then he gave her his hand. Nancy placed her own on his palm, and when she looked up, she saw her husband in front of her. William said confusedly, "You were supposed to." She didn't finish. "Isn't it good to have you home already?" she said, feigning joy at the reunion. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Anthony in the distance. He was walking towards the restaurant. "Weren't expecting him?" William asked, putting his hand on his wife's back. He had to cancel his business trip due to some circumstances. Was the surprise a success? "I agree," said Nancy, going over in her head the possible reason for her being here. "Let me walk you out," offered her husband, giving Vanessa an elbow. She laughed. "There's nowhere else to go. My tailor has just written that his plans have changed, and he won't be able to meet me today." Nancy lied, looming the foam in front of William's face. "What's with the non-seriousness?" William made a joke. "Well, then maybe the two of us can have lunch. While we're here, he suggested. With a bright smile, Nancy agreed. Husband and wife entered the restaurant. Costas escorted them to a free table. Yes, and here it was not bad, William noticed, seated on a comfortable leather sofa. Nancy cast brief glances around looking for Anthony. He was sitting to her right and slightly behind William. Yeah, I like this place too. She muttered a sweet smile. Her cell phone rang. Seeing Anthony's name on the phone screen, she turned pale. Rejecting the call, she hid it in her purse. Who is it? Her husband inquired. It's my sister calling. She wants me to help her pick out an outfit for the wedding. Nancy lied. She was ashamed of having to lie. Why didn't you answer it? Sat down her husband. At this time, Nancy glanced at Anthony, who was dialing her number again. She held a concerned look on him for a couple of seconds. What's wrong with you? Asked her husband, turning around. But by this time, Anthony had already left his table. Nancy sighed with a sigh of relief. It seemed that the tailor had come. But I was wrong, Nancy replied as she began her meal. The waiter had just brought the appetizing dishes. After dinner, William and Nancy stopped at a place for a while, and then they returned home. We haven't been paying much attention to each other lately, William said, stroking Nancy's hand. William was right. The various affairs were a great distraction from family life. It seemed that the person you had been with for years would always be with you, and you could spend time with them at any time. And in reality, that day keeps getting put off and put off for later. Now I'll give you a relaxing massage, said William, and opened the drawer to pull out his wife's favorite passenger. Oh, where did you get that? Asked William. When I saw a beautiful piece of jewelry in there. I didn't tell you. I bought it for myself for my son's wedding. Nancy lied again. It was a necklace Anthony had given her when she'd rushed to meet him. She took it out of her purse and put it in a drawer. I don't remember you ever liking that color combination, her husband said. He didn't show it, but inside he had doubts about Natalia's loyalty. Lately she had been distracted, according to the driver, often traveling to the same place for appointments. William lowered himself onto the bed and began gently modeling his lover's back with her smooth silk. The clear skin was driving him crazy. When her back the couple claimed, he gently touched it with his lips. William opened his eyes. Dusk was thickening in the room. The sun had almost set over the horizon. He turned his head and saw that his wife was sound asleep. William silently got out of bed, going to his room. The burned screen of Nancy's phone made him stop. His eyes read the text on their own. My queen likes to take risks. William wondered who it could be from. He felt rage filling him. He couldn't resist and read the entire message from a user named Anthony. The first minute, he wanted to immediately confront his wife. However, seeing the familiar name Julia in the correspondence, he decided to wait. Taking Nancy's cell phone with him, he went to meet his son. William drove up to his friend Max's house. His son met him. Together, they walked into the house. William asked if they could talk privately, and then he told his son everything. Max, don't be silly. You can't get hot. You'll make things worse, the father said. Max walked back and forth with his hands on his head. Now the most important thing is that the girl was all right, said the father. Yeah, you're right. How do we get her out of there? Max wondered. Only simple axe options came to mind. Night had fallen outside. The fresh, cool breeze was very pleasant. A black Jeep behind tinted windows pulled up in front of Anthony's house. The man was getting ready for the meeting. He put on his best suit, offspring all the best fragrance. He was glad that Nancy had come to see him again. Anthony opened the door and was stunned. He was sure it was his favorite woman, so he didn't look at the camera. Standing in front of him was William. His eyes penetrated Anthony through and through. The one threw into a sweat trying to pretend that all was well. He portrayed on his face a look of surprise, which was replaced by a smile and joy at the meeting. How many years, how many winters? Just like that, William stopped him half-heartedly. He launched a solid fist in a single blow, knocking him to the ground. Anthony went tumbling backwards. William entered the house, looking around. Max came in after him. Where is she? He asked Anthony with an angry look. Who exactly? Anthony turned on the fool and then laughed. Max walked up to him and, taking him by the collar, shook him properly. If you've done anything to her, I'll give you a hard time, growled at Max. William hastened to relieve him. Anthony spat on the floor. That's how karma catches up with a man. Now your wife and your fiancé are mine. He laughed, in spite of them. Julia, shouted Max, and then went upstairs, looking in every room. While the men were downstairs, Julia, unaware that they had already come for her, found something to do. In the corner of the room, she saw a sewing machine, and to calm herself down, she began to sew. The space and conditions allowed her to sew. There was also a small refrigerator in the room, something like a minibar, and she got a couple of fruits and cookies and continued sewing. Time flew by very quickly. She didn't notice that it was already dark outside. A strange noise that hadn't been there before made the girl take her foot off the pedal and listen when she realized Max was calling her. She started to knock and called his name back. Better hold still, said William, pointing a gun at Anthony. Whoa, someone wants to play, Anthony said, slowly getting to his feet. I'm not going to have anything to do with you, William replied. We're here to pick up my son's fiancé. I don't care about anything else, William said, so as not to cause more conflict. Just like you took my bride from me once, shouted Anthony. And the next second, he had a gun in his hand too. You know she made her own choice. And yes, I love my wife, even though... William was silent, even though he had to finish the sentence. She chose me this time, Anthony said, provoking William to more conflict. But in the meantime, Max had found the room where Julia was. But the door was locked. Max tried to break it down, but it wouldn't budge. Grabbing the nightstand in his hand, he rushed up the small staircase and with all his strength crashed into the door. Unable to withstand such an onslaught, it burst open into a lock. Max exclaimed joyfully, Julia, I knew you would find me. I felt it, she said, clutching Max to her chest. Sweetheart, are you all right? Max asked. Don't worry, I'm fine. No one did anything to me, she replied. His embrace. Max and Julia were coming downstairs. The first to go was Max. On the corner, he noticed that his father had a firearm in his hands just like Anthony. Max was afraid for his father. Julia stuck out her chassis, managing to cover her mouth. Stay here, Max whispered. Julia lifted her lips, clutching at Max's sleeve. She didn't want to let him go since Anthony was standing with his back to Max. This allowed the guy to get very close. You have to make amends, Anthony said, referring to the fact that Nancy didn't choose him. William answered well and lowered the gun. Shoot. I deserve it, he said. Anthony felt the taste of victory and the approaching pleasure of retribution. He took the gun off the safety on his forehead. He stepped out, then another second, and there was a bang, and then a shot. Anthony fell off his feet. Max managed to disable him by hitting the huge statue. When he shifted his gaze to his father, he saw a red stain on his shoulder, which he covered with his hand. Max quickly called an ambulance. The marriage ceremony began at 1 o'clock sharp. Julia was irresistible. The wedding dress, which had been sewn to her own pattern, was eye-catching and made her want to get one. Max looked at the bride with admiration. He could not believe that, despite the difficulties, their wedding had taken place. Son, you're not mad at me. But his father asked him a letter. When all the guests gathered at the restaurant after the registry office, No, Dad, you had every right to do that, replied Max, who did not care how much money he had in his account. When there was a man around for whom you want to do real deeds, I knew you could do it, said his father, patting him on the shoulder. Max turned and saw Alexa's grandfather. The old man winked at him. It's good to take risks when you have a safety net in the form of good people, Max thought. Nancy, who had taken this desperate step, certainly felt guilt and shame. But Julia's sincere attitude and her husband's inner strength helped her to remain human. After all that happened, Nancy and William became estranged from each other. It is understandable that forgiveness takes time. Anthony, after coming to his senses, cut Nancy out of his life for good. The newlyweds were able to open a sewing studio. Julia came up with clothing models, created patterns herself, and Max was engaged in advertising and sales. not forgetting about the issue of a fashion magazine. Alex's grandfather continued to live in his old house. Now that Julia and Max had moved into their own house, he was finally able to get a cat, which he had not allowed himself before because of his granddaughter's allergies. The life of the townspeople went on as usual, and only the spaniel Herman was languidly walking around the house looking for a companion to play with.